Over the course of nearly 100 episodes of the Found My Fitness podcast, I've had the privilege of interviewing some of the most prestigious researchers in the fields of exercise physiology, nutrition, human performance. And these conversations have really brought together some of the greatest minds and knowledge in the field of exercise physiology. I'm excited to introduce my special guest today, Brady Holmer, who is an accomplished endurance athlete with an incredibly high VO2 max. Brady and I set out together to work on a pretty ambitious project where we wanted to distill a lot of the cutting edge research that was discussed on the Found My Fitness podcast from these leading experts into a guide that not only was evidence-based, but had actionable insights for people. It's called the How to Train According to the Experts Guide. So I think the result is we have this really great roadmap that people can follow, looking for how to improve whatever the end goals that they're looking for, whether that is optimizing their cardiorespiratory fitness or their hypertrophy training, or perhaps even body recomposition. So in this training guide, we cover a lot of different aspects of exercise, including training protocols to improve cardiorespiratory fitness, training protocols to delay heart aging and improve the cardiovascular structure of the heart. We also have a lot of information in there on how to train to improve metabolism, mitochondrial metabolism, glucose metabolism. And then we also get into resistance training protocols, whether you're interested in improving strength, bone mass, bone density, muscle hypertrophy, or losing fat at the same time while you're gaining muscle. So that would be body recomposition. In addition, we have some supplemental information in there on sauna use, other protein intake, and other supplements like omega-3 and creatine. So a lot of really great information in this guide. You can find that guide and download it for free in howtotrainguide.com. So that being said, today's episode will serve as a companion to that guide. Brady and I will discuss a lot of the information you'll find in the free guide, and we'll probably give some of our personal takeaways as well.
Yeah, Rhonda, I think putting together this guide, it was incredible. I got to listen and re-listen to many of the interviews that you had with some of these world-leading experts, and I personally learned a lot and had a lot of fun putting it together. So we're going to cover a lot of things today, and I think what we're going to start with is aerobic exercise training, kind of a very popular topic these days with people interested in how to improve their VO2 max and their cardiovascular health. You've interviewed experts in this area, including Dr. Martin Gabala, kind of an expert in high-intensity interval training, exercise physiology, and Dr. Benjamin Levine, who honestly gave like a masterclass on just how to improve heart health. I found that episode very interesting. So we're going to start today with talking to people about how to improve their cardiovascular health, their VO2 max with aerobic exercise training.
One of your areas of expertise. I agree that when Dr. Ben Levine came on the podcast, while I was doing, a lot of background information research on, his work, so reading his publications, and then after the podcast episode, I felt like I learned just a tremendous amount of information that I had no idea about, which is really like the cardiovascular structure and what role the structure of the heart plays in cardiovascular health. But I do think before we get started, we should probably mention that it's important, I think, for people to identify what their goals are with respect to training. So are you someone that's interested in becoming an elite endurance athlete like yourself? Or are you interested in improving your health metrics, so maybe increasing your health span, so to speak, reducing your cardiovascular disease risk, reducing your dementia risk, reducing your risk of cancer, all the while, improving mental health, improving muscle mass, maintaining independence with age. These are all things that are my personal goals, and I do think the guide covers a lot of those bases. But again, some people might be training for different goals.
Yeah, certainly. I think that, in this guide, there are a lot of protocols that we're going to provide, and I think they mostly gear towards people improving their longevity, their health span, and optimizing health. But, if you're a performance-oriented person and are looking to get stronger or compete, whether that's in some type of resistance training competition, or maybe you're on a faster 5K or 10K, this guide has those types of things too. As you call me an elite endurance athlete. I'm kind of far from elite, but I appreciate that sentiment.
Brady is being a bit modest. Not only is he elite from a cardiorespiratory fitness standpoint, if not strictly a competitive standpoint, he also has a master's in science, a research background, and is wicked smart.
But, I have performance goals, obviously, which are to run a fast marathon. That's kind of these days what my primary goal has been. And so, I might train differently from somebody who just wants to get healthier or improve their health span if they're in middle age or older age, or, even younger people who are just kind of getting into exercise. So, it's important to define the goals, and that will kind of determine how you want to train. And even though my goal is to optimize to run a fast marathon, given that it's not my full-time job just to run fast, and I have other goals like reducing my injury risk and just having a high level of vitality, I also want to, train for brain health. Like you, Rhonda, I think I find the benefits of exercise on my brain one of the kind of most salient benefits of exercise. But I also just want to be strong, be able to do things and, maintain health late into life so I can keep doing the things that I want to do. So I think the way I approach training is try to optimize for performance, but not at the extent of sacrificing some of my, other health metrics. So I try to blend a little bit of the two.
Well, with the VO2 max of 75?
75 and to 80 is, I've tested a few times throughout my life. And so it's somewhere in that range.
That's why I would say you're elite, but
maybe an elite level VO2 max, but my running times wouldn't be considered elite by most standards.
Well, speaking of cardiorespiratory fitness, I think that would be a good place to start. It is something that we've covered quite a bit on the podcast. And Dr. Ben Levine, when I had him on the podcast, really, he was discussing just an eye-opening study for me that he was a part of. It was a study that was done over the course of 30 years. It was two separate studies, and known as the Dallas bed rest study. And the study involved, first of all, Dr. Lean's mentor, Jerry Mitchell, who was studying a group of men and looking at the effects of being sedentary on their cardiorespiratory fitness and other cardiovascular health parameters. And when I say sedentary, I mean full-on sedentary. They underwent bed rest for 3 weeks. So what that study found was, lo and behold, when you're actually not moving for 3 weeks, not even getting up to go to the bathroom. So they had catheters. This was extreme bed rest. They really wanted to look and see what happened to cardiovascular function, cardiorespiratory fitness after just not moving for 3 weeks. Of course, lo and behold, cardiorespiratory fitness declined. Not so surprising, as well as a lot of the other parameters they measured. But what was really eye-opening to me was, fast forward 30 years, Dr. Levine is now in Jerry Mitchell's lab, and they find those same group of men, and they wanted to see what 30 years of aging had done to their cardiorespiratory fitness, which does naturally decline with age. And what they found was that their cardiorespiratory fitness, after 30 years of aging, was no worse than their cardiorespiratory fitness after 3 weeks of bed rest 30 years ago. So essentially, 3 weeks of bed rest is worse for your cardiovascular health, for your cardiorespiratory fitness, than 30 years of aging. And when you put it like that, it's like, wow, being sedentary is so detrimental on our cardiovascular health. So maybe you can, Brady, just kind of recap, highlight, talk about what cardiorespiratory fitness is, how you measure it. I guess we'll get into some ways to improve it, but this is something that you have a lot of experience in as well.
I think people will be pretty familiar with the term cardiorespiratory fitness. It's sometimes used interchangeably with VO2 max, or your maximal oxygen consumption. It's kind of a very popular biomarker these days with, like you said, and we'll talk about later, correlating with longevity and so on. So cardiorespiratory fitness is sort of the exercise physiologist's measure of aerobic fitness. It's very popular as an endurance performance marker, or that's traditionally how it was thought of, because, having a high VO2 max is kind of standard among high-level endurance athletes. But essentially what it is your body's ability to take in oxygen, take in air from the environment, distribute it to the rest of the body through your cardiovascular system, get that oxygen into mitochondria and skeletal muscle, and then utilize that oxygen for energy in the form of ATP. So it sort of represents your body's integrative ability to take in, distribute, and utilize oxygen. And again, I think we'll talk about this later, but I think that's why it's such a potent predictor of longevity. It's because it's not maybe just something like grip strength, but it really represents, your body's physical function and your ability to produce ATP. it's measured during maximal exercise, hence the term maximal oxygen consumption. So one of the ways that it's typically measured, say if you were in an exercise physiology study, you would get on a treadmill, you would run at progressively faster speeds until eventually you just couldn't go anymore. So you would exercise until exhaustion, all the while having your gas exchange measured. So you're going to be wearing a mask to measure your oxygen intake. And that's able to, measure the rate of oxygen utilization by your body. And at the point of maximal exertion, however much oxygen your body is utilizing, that's your maximal oxygen, your rate of oxygen consumption. And it's not a fun test. That's the main way to measure it, and probably the gold standard way to measure it would be during an incremental exercise test to exhaustion. But it can also be measured or estimated rather using things like the Cooper 12-minute test, which essentially involves you just running kind of as far as you can in 12 minutes. And there are online calculators where you can put your time into there to get an estimate. You can also get an estimate of your VO2 max by, if you have a smartwatch or something like that, a fitness tracker, that will also allow you to estimate it. And I say estimate because, without direct measures of gas exchange, you're not really able to definitively say what that is, but it uses various things like your age, sex, weight, and your physical fitness metrics to estimate that. So those are kind of the three primary ways that people can measure it. Dr. Levine kind of talked about some of the flaws with estimating it using those equations versus, obviously getting it directly measured into a lab. But yeah, it's a performance marker, obviously, but it's also a health marker. And I think Levine talked about how important it was not only for improving it, but also to try to maintain it throughout lifespan.
Yeah, it's something that I in the past, I would say 2 to 3 years, it kind of came on my radar as an important biomarker for longevity, right? There's a variety of biomarkers that can be looked at. And, as you mentioned, even compared to something like grip strength, cardiorespiratory fitness seems to really shine in terms of being a good indicator of your overall health status. When Levine was on the podcast, Dr. Levine was talking about, it takes a certain amount of oxygen, like your cardiorespiratory fitness has to be a certain level just to sit down and have a conversation like we're having, right? And if you're a sedentary person that really hasn't tried to improve their cardiorespiratory fitness like at all, as you get older, because it does decline, like even maintaining that just level of just having a conversation or maybe walking to the bathroom or walking to your car, you're so out of breath. That's when you're really reaching this level where you have to be concerned about falling off a cliff, right? When just normal everyday functioning is hard. But even above and beyond that, there's been just numerous studies that have looked at the correlation of VO2 max, so cardiorespiratory fitness, and all-cause mortality. One I've talked about, and I talked about with Levine as well, was a published study in JAMA Medical Journal in 2018, where I think it was like participants that were involved in they were previous veterans. And so they were sort of looked at according to their cardiorespiratory fitness, and the people that were in the highest group had a 5-year increased life expectancy compared to people in the lowest cardiorespiratory fitness group, which is pretty profound. I mean, you're talking about 5 years. But also, even if you looked at the people in the very highest group and you compared them to people in the high normal, so they were still like on the high normal end, they're doing good. Like those people in the highest group had a 20% lower all-cause mortality. So they were still doing better than the people that had a high normal cardiorespiratory fitness. But I think also what was really surprising to me in that study was that the people in that low cardiorespiratory fitness group had a mortality risk that was comparable or even worse than people with diseases that we know are clearly bad for your health, like type 2 diabetes, like heart disease, hypertension, even smokers. So in other words, again, going back to this Dallas bed rest study as well, where being sedentary for 3 weeks was worse on your cardiovascular health than 30 years of aging. It really drives home that point that when you're sedentary and your cardiorespiratory fitness is falling, it is a disease. Being sedentary is a disease. And I do think that low cardiorespiratory fitness should be considered kind of like a disease marker as well. A lot more can be said about VO2 max and cardiorespiratory fitness. You kind of mentioned a little bit about athletes being interested in VO2 max and improving their VO2 max. Can you talk a little bit about why maybe athletes think about training explicitly for VO2 max, or maybe why they don't?
Yeah, I think the answer to that would be they sort of do and they don't. I mean, I guess it would depend maybe what type of athletes we're talking about. So I guess maybe we'll use endurance athletes, maybe like such as myself as an example. Like you mentioned before, I have a generally high VO2 max. And while what I like to think about it is, having a high VO2 max, if you want to be an endurance athlete, is sort of a prerequisite to kind of get in the door. You won't find someone in the Olympics or, even at a sub-elite level who probably doesn't have a VO2 max of 65 or above. So it's sort of this ticket to get into the gate of, if you want to be an endurance athlete, you need to have a VO2 max of 65 or higher. But once you get kind of to those higher levels of elite athletes who all have that VO2 max of above 65, it doesn't do a very good job of predicting who's going to win the race. So if we line up at the start line and you say you don't have any idea of people's previous performance, but you just have their VO2 maxes, the person with the highest VO2 max isn't always going to win. And that's because there are several other performance markers that are associated with doing well in, say, a race, like how long you can run at a high percent of your VO2 max, your lactate threshold, your exercise economy. These are all things that you can improve independent of your VO2 max that can help improve your performance. So yes, while I want to do VO2 max workouts as an endurance athlete, and most endurance athletes will do VO2 max type workouts every now and then, once a week, in the form of high intensity intervals, they can also do workouts that are targeting, getting better at running economy or training their lactate threshold. So you can get better without improving your VO2 max. I think that's important, not just for athletes to know, but just people who are generally interested in health. If you're training and you don't see, your VO2 max on your watch isn't necessarily improving, well, you can still get faster. You can still get stronger, improve your exercise performance while not improving your VO2 max. So it's for that reason, I think that athletes sometimes don't just think about explicitly training their VO2 max. Many elite athletes might not even know what their VO2 max is because they don't care. They just really care about how fast they're running. But then, of course, athletes should be concerned about increasing their VO2 max, not only for the health reasons that you just mentioned, it's associated with longevity, which is great. You want to avoid that decline with age and maintain it as long as possible. But again, you can see significant improvements when you do improve your VO2 max, which can be thought of as your ceiling. If you move your ceiling up, everything below that is going to improve. So short answer to that would be, yeah, athletes look to improve their VO2 max. Among the highest people with the highest VO2 maxes, it might not be as much of a concern, but people are all still interested. Athletes and non-athletes alike are interested in improving their VO2 max.
Well, you allude a little bit to, you said high intensity interval training, and that's, one way that you can improve VO2 max. And I think we're going to get into that in a minute, talking about Dr. Martin Cabala's research. But I'm interested. So let's say, you want to improve your lactate clearance, one that you mentioned. What kind of training? How do you train differently than doing like high intensity interval training? How would you improve your lactate clearance more?
Yeah, you can certainly do that by using high intensity interval training. I mean, you're producing a lot of lactate during high intensity interval training, so you're inherently going to help improve your lactate clearance capacity. Doing what would be called kind of steady state or threshold workouts is kind of one way to do that, where you're exercising at that point where lactate levels are just above kind of the steady state. So you're working on, where lactate production equals lactate clearance, doing those type of what would be called lactate threshold workouts. That seems to obviously be a good way to improve your lactate clearance capacity. And then there are others who would argue or say, I think there's decent evidence to support that something like zone 2 training also improves your lactate clearance capacity. So you can do all different types of training, and we're going to talk about low, moderate, and high intensity training and why integrating all of those is important. But primarily the main way to do that is going to be doing like steady state type and high intensity interval training workouts.
Well, so high intensity interval training workouts, like Dr. Martin Cabala was on the podcast, and he's really an expert in high intensity interval training. And there are a lot of people that are interested in the time efficiency of it. So high intensity interval training, I guess there's a lot of ways to define it. Marty likes to talk about it being like when you're doing the interval that you're doing vigorous exercise, and that could be different for a lot of people depending on your fitness level. But essentially, it's you're working harder than you can't really have a conversation when you're doing that interval. So you're going really hard. Most people are about 80 to 85% at least maximum heart rate for the interval, and then they have these periods of recovery and then go back to the working second part, the interval again. What was really interesting to me with respect to improving cardiorespiratory fitness, when Marty came on the podcast, he was talking about a meta-analysis that had looked at a variety of different studies where people were meeting the requirements for moderate intensity exercise. So they were doing about 150 minutes a week of what is called moderate intensity exercise. So they're probably doing, something more like a zone 2 where they're, or maybe even a little bit less than that, but, something like 60 to 80% their max heart rate. And about 40% of those individuals didn't see improvements in their cardiorespiratory fitness unless some high intensity interval training or some more vigorous exercise was sort of added to the equation. So can you talk a little bit more about you mix in, high intensity interval training into your workouts, but why do you think there's this sort of non-responder effect, or there's probably multiple reasons for it, but what's the rationale for adding in more vigorous type of exercise or high intensity interval training into a workout to improve cardiorespiratory fitness?
Yeah, so I think if you take a group of people who have never trained before, kind of unfit people, and just give them a lot of lower intensity or, what people might refer to as zone 2 training, everybody is going to kind of improve because it's a new training stimulus. You've never trained before, you add some exercise. Okay, well, obviously you're going to get fitter. And you mentioned the concept of non-responders, which has kind of been around in exercise physiology for a while. And it essentially refers to, you give people an exercise training program. There are some people who don't improve for some reason or another, their VO2 max. And I think there's kind of a debate on there where it might just be due to a measurement error instead of actually a non-response. But like you just mentioned, when you give those people high intensity interval training, everybody responds. There's some kind of recent studies that show that very well. You just increase their dose of exercise or their intensity or both, and they improve their fitness. So they're just basically not doing enough. And so that points to the fact that if you want to get better, you need to add in some higher intensity interval training. Obviously, you could increase the dose of your moderate intensity training to your volume, but adding a greater stimulus, that seems to be the main benefit of doing high intensity training. You can't just do the same thing. You can't just do low intensity training all the time. You need to not only mix it up for variety, but you need to give your body a greater stimulus if you want it to adapt and improve. And so Dr. Martin Gabala was talking a lot during your interview about the importance of doing that, doing HIIT probably at least once a week, elevating your heart rate just to get that additional stimulus to force your body to adapt, get stronger, for your heart to get stronger, and for your cardiovascular system to get fitter.
Yeah, it's actually Dr. Levine also mentioned something similar where he was saying, you have to continually stress your cardiovascular system to have the adaptations, the beneficial adaptations. And so if you keep doing the same thing without ever adding an additional stress or stimulus, then you're only going to stay the same, maybe. You're not really going to improve, right? And so it does make sense from that aspect as well. Since we're talking about vigorous intensity and adding more of a stressor and a more stronger stimulus, maybe you can recap some of what Dr. Levine, Dr. Gabala talked about on the podcast when they were sort of defining the various training zones and what these zones are, because there is a lot of information out there on that, which can be quite confusing to people.
It can be. And some people will like to use zones for training. I think it's common in sort of the exercise with, coaches who are coaching endurance athletes to use this 5-zone model. If people, are familiar with listening to podcasts on fitness, they'll probably hear people reference 5 zones. There are obviously other zones to use, but yeah, Dr. Levine defined these sort of 5 training zones. And kind of before I go and define what these are and how people can use them to guide their training, I think he kind of defined them using 3 different metrics, and that we're going to use to define each of the zones. But lactate levels are one way to do it, but we're not really going to discuss that because in reality, most people are not going to be measuring their lactate levels weekly, monthly, or even, certainly not daily during exercise. And so it's kind of a moot point to say, zone 2 exercise is this lactate level. Most people don't really know what that is. And so there are other ways to measure intensities and use these zones. One way is just your rating of perceived exertion, or RPE. And this is just a subjective measure of how hard you think you're exercising. And this is typically on a 6 to 20 scale. Now, that might seem kind of weird for people, why is it not 1 to 10? 1 to 10 is kind of typical when people use how hard is this scale? But it's called the Borg RPE scale. And the 6 to 20 is essentially because initially the theory behind that scale was that you would just add a 0 to whatever your RPE was, and that would correspond to your heart rate. So say average person has a maximal heart rate of around 200. If I give you an RPE of 18, that means my heart rate's probably around 180, which is a fairly high intensity. Whereas maybe my RPE right now is a 6, maybe my heart rate's 60, that's like a resting heart rate. So that's kind of the idea behind that scale. So people kind of can understand what that means and why we're doing 6 to 20 versus 1 to 10. Another way is to use the talk test. And that's essentially just like, are you able to do a full conversation, barely get out words, or not talk at all? That's kind of another way to kind of gauge zones. The next and the final way to describe the zone is to be based on your percentage of your maximal heart rate. And a lot of people have heart rate monitors, so they're going to be able to measure their heart rate during exercise. So we're going to define zones using all three of those kind of metrics. So if we look at zone 1, this is going to be a recovery intensity. This is pretty much easy as you can go. It's not resting, but it's very, very light activity. So on the RPE scale, this is going to be anywhere from a 6 to an 8. It's going to be about 50 to 60% of your maximal heart rate. And if you're going to use the talk test to measure that intensity, it would be, you could hold a full conversation. So what you and I are doing right now, Rhonda, just talking, having a podcast, you could basically do that if you were in zone 1 or recovery intensity because you're going on an easy walk or something like that. Zone 2 intensity, people will hear about zone 2 training all the time. This is still kind of a light to a moderate intensity exercise. So it's going to correspond to an RPE of about 9 to 12, 60 to 70% of your maximal heart rate. And then the talk test, again, you should be able to have a conversation in zone 2. If someone were listening to you, they could probably tell you were exercising, but in general, you could hold pretty much a full conversation. And so these, zone 1 and zone 2, those are going to be your light to moderate intensity exercises. In particular, that zone 2 training, good for kind of building your aerobic base. Then there's zone 3. This is kind of veering into the territory of high intensity interval training. It's thought of a lot as your threshold intensity or maybe steady state exercise. It's going to correspond to an RPE of 13 to 15, about 70 to 80% of your maximal heart rate. And then this is where talking gets a little bit difficult. So you could speak in broken sentences. It's still you're not gasping for air yet, but you can speak in broken sentences, and that would be a good way to indicate kind of this zone during using the talk test. And then zone 4, this is where you get into the high intensity training. So it's a 16 to 18 RPE. It's 80 to 95% of your maximal heart rate, and you could probably only speak one word or two at a time, maybe if you were trying to gauge that zone based on the talk test. And then zone 5, that's maximal exercise intensity. That's your VO2 max. It's as hard as you can go. So RPE 19 or 20, it's 95+% of your maximal heart rate. And then you shouldn't be able to talk. So if you're doing, Tabata intervals or something like that, this is zone 5. You shouldn't be able to talk at all during that exercise intensity. So those are the 5 zones. And I think what's cool about having all these different metrics to define the zones is that, if people don't really want to train using heart rate, or maybe they don't even have a heart rate monitor, they can use the talk test, they can use RPE, or maybe a combination of all 3 of these. And they're pretty reliable. I mean, all of these have been kind of well evidenced to correspond to the different zones. But I think what's nice is that people can use these to train, and it doesn't require a lot of technical ability, a lot of experience. And so this is, I think, in my mind, the best way that people can think about kind of training intensities is using the zones as we define them here, or at least using those as a guide.
I really like the talk test way of defining it, because as you were sitting here talking about this, I was thinking about my whole exercise protocol, and I'm like, okay, oh yeah, that's actually what I thought was more zone 2 is really more zone 3, what I'm doing here. With respect to heart rate monitors, I know Levine mentioned there can be a lot of error with using something like a smartwatch. And is there more accuracy in using something like a chest strap, like maybe a polar strap, versus a smartwatch versus like the talk test? So let's say you don't have a chest strap. Should you be using a talk test, or can you still use your smartwatch? Is it still, what's more accurate?
Yeah, I think the accuracy of the smartwatches is obviously there. They've been, validated against EKG and things like that. But as Levine mentioned, and as others have kind of drawn caution, they tend to get less accurate as the intensity of exercise increases. They're not perfect because, it's getting your heart rate reading from a sensor on your wrist versus your chest. So I would encourage everybody to invest in a heart rate a chest strap monitor. It's less than $100 investment. It's going to give you a lot more accurate data. Some people find them uncomfortable, but most of them now are pretty comfortable. And if you really want to train using heart rate, I would say invest in the chest strap. But, the watches aren't totally off, and they can be used as a good kind of reference as to where you are. But like I said, in my experience, and I think the experience of others, the harder that you go, the higher the intensity goes, kind of the less accurate that they get. So if you want to use heart rate, great, it can be a good indicator, but the talk test is a very good, I think, way to assess your exercise intensity, especially for people who are newer. So I think one of the, not flaws with RPE, but one of the caveats is that you need a little bit of experience to really know where you're at, like how hard something is. I mean, if somebody has never actually gone to a maximal intensity, then how do you know what a 20 out of 20 is if you've never really reached the point of volitional exhaustion? So if somebody is just beginning to exercise, they might be at 70% of their maximal intensity, but they might think that they're at a 20. So it takes time to learn kind of what your RPE is to be able to assess that accurately. So I would say, if people are more experienced with exercise, then you could use something like RPE to kind of gauge your intensity. But those newer to exercise might actually have a lot of good feedback with the talk test. I even kind of use that. I mean, it's, if you're running with a group of people and you can have a conversation, okay, well, we're probably in zone 2. If I'm really struggling to breathe, then I might be in zone 3, 4, or even 5. So I think it's a great way to use the talk test. Anybody can use it, but I think newer people might benefit more from that. And I think also what people can think about doing is using a combination of all three. You can use heart rate, you can use RPE, you can use the talk test, and maybe see if those, correlate with one another during exercise. But use all of those to kind of inform your exercise intensity.
Exactly. I usually am not wearing, I do have a chest strap. I have a Polish chest strap. I have used it before, but I'm not typically wearing it when I'm doing a workout. And so I think using my Apple Watch along with the talk test, because I often have someone with me when I'm working out, is like, okay, well, maybe it's not entirely accurate as I'm getting into my zone 3, perhaps zone 4, but I know I can't talk more than a word. So it's clearly it's good to combine them both. So there's a lot of interest in zone 2 training. I talked about zone 2 training with Dr. Martin Gabala, a little bit with Dr. Ben Levine. And I want to ask you, maybe you can talk a little bit about what are the benefits of zone 2 training? Are there unique benefits of zone 2 training metabolically, cardiorespiratory, health-wise? And as you were explaining and defining some of these zones, I was thinking to myself even, what's the real difference between zone 2 and what you would call zone 3, right? This threshold type of training as well, right? So I'd love to hear.
Yeah, the benefits of zone 2 training, I think, are kind of vast. I mean, a lot of people will talk about how some of the main benefits are going to be, it really serves as a foundation for building your aerobic base. It's good for, maybe I should step back a little bit and kind of define what zone 2 is, maybe based on the exercise physiologist's definition of it, which would be, it's kind of the intensity where you're maximizing your mitochondrial fat oxidation. It's a steady state exercise, less so than a threshold like intensity. And so your lactate levels, it's measured during lactate is kind of the accurate way to do it. So your lactate levels are steady, they're not increasing. Some will actually give a lactate number being about 2 millimolar. I mean, I think there may be kind of some debate about that, because I think as I've heard you talk about multiple times, people will have different lactate levels. And so 2 millimolar might not represent a zone 2 intensity for everyone. It might differ based on whether you're unfit or you're a fit athlete or something like that. So I think it's important, though, that you're at a steady, your lactate levels aren't continually rising during zone 2 training. But the key, I think, and one of the main benefits purported for zone 2 is that you're improving your fat burning capacity, not only during exercise, but also your mitochondria's ability to oxidize fat as an energy source, because that's the intensity at which the fat oxidation in the mitochondria is maximal. Zone 2 training, elite athletes are doing a lot of it, in particular just because their exercise volumes are so high. And so I think one of the, areas of not disagreement, but kind of conflict is that people will say you need to do a lot of zone 2 training, it needs to make up a majority of your exercise training. And a lot of what those people are referring to, whether they're coaches, is that, these are elite athletes doing 20 to 30 hours a week. Well, obviously they do a lot of zone 2 training because they're exercising for 20 to 30 hours per week. There are certainly benefits to that for building the aerobic base that allows you to do a high level of volume without burnout. There's a very low injury risk with zone 2 training because it's a lighter intensity. You're not overly stressing your autonomic nervous system or your cardiovascular system. And so it has these benefits of just allowing you to do a lot of low intensity volume to build, what's called the aerobic base. and improve your fat burning capacity. And those seem to be the main benefits. And I think defining it, though, is important because zone 2 gets talked about a lot, but in reality, we just talked about different ways to define zone 2 based on the talk test, based on RPE, based on heart rate. When most people say that they're doing zone 2 training, they really don't know if they're doing zone 2 training because you're not measuring lactate. Really, without a lactate, or you're not measuring your fat oxidation rate in the mitochondria, you don't really know if you're in a physiological zone 2. It correlates with all of those other kind of subjective and objective measures that we talked about, like heart rate. But to say that, you're doing zone 2 training isn't necessarily accurate unless you're, actually have a accurate measure of lactate. But there are certainly several benefits to zone 2, or what I like to just refer to as low to moderate intensity training. I think that's more accurate, and certainly a more accurate way that people can refer to that type of training.
Well, you mentioned a pretty daunting number here. You said 20 to 30 hours of exercise a week, which is far beyond what I myself do. I'm more in the 6 to 6.5 hours a week. And so, the question is, if you are not doing 20 to 30 hours, let's say you're doing maybe 5 or even less than that, you're getting like 2.5. This is where Dr. Gabala on the podcast was talking about high intensity interval training being really time efficient and having many of the same benefits as even like a zone 2 type of training with respect to mitochondrial benefits, cardiorespiratory benefits, if not even better if the same volume of exercise is performed. In other words, if you're doing 30 minutes of zone 2 and then a 30-minute high intensity interval training workout, that you're going to have even more improvements in cardiorespiratory fitness than you would zone 2. You're going to have better improvements in even mitochondrial density, for example, than you would. So it's kind of interesting to look at the benefits of doing something like high intensity interval training. Now, you're not going to do 20 hours of HIIT. I mean, that's impossible, right? And like you were saying, burnout and things like that are also an issue, and you have to, be able to space them out with recovery. But there are a lot of benefits to doing high intensity interval training. Time efficiency, you get improvements in cardiorespiratory fitness. We talked about that with even people that were doing regular, low to moderate intensity exercise for 150 minutes a week. They needed to really stress their system a little bit more above and beyond that to get improvements. Not everyone, but a large percentage of them did. And then there's also some brain benefits that are also really, I don't want to say uniquely associated with high intensity interval training or vigorous exercise, but also the benefits are associated with the lactate that you're producing, which does come with increasing exercise intensity, right? So if people are time limited and they want to combine some zone 2 training with HIIT, like, can you combine them in one session? Like, can you, I was talking about, with you the other day, like sometimes I'll do my jog, or I'll do like a zone 2 workout, and then I'll add in some intervals, right? Where I'm like going pretty hard for a certain amount of time. And then I kind of go back to a slower pace where I can have a talk test after my heart rate comes down a little bit.
Yeah, it's interesting because I think certainly, there was kind of this debate in like, oh, do you need to do you need to keep your really easy days easy, or can you combine it with zone 4 or zone 5, like high intensity interval training? I think it's a unique concept, especially for, as we talk about the time efficiency of it. Maybe there are people who only have 2 to 3 days per week when they can engage in aerobic exercise, and they want to do some moderate and some high intensity training on the same day. I mean, in reality, like when you do a high intensity interval training session, you're kind of doing a little bit of moderate intensity because, as I'm sure you structure your protocols, Rhonda, and like I structure my interval training workouts, I'm doing, probably 20 to 30 minutes of warm up or more and a cool down, which is at a lighter intensity. And then I'm doing the main session, which has some high intensity intervals. But, 50% of that session might actually be at a low intensity heart rate. But yeah, I think it's interesting to think about doing, if somebody wanted to do a 30 to 45 minute, say just a zone 2, as we'll call it, maybe low to moderate intensity run or a ride, or maybe even a slow walk, and then finish with some high intensity intervals. I think that's a great strategy that people can use if they want to get some high intensity training and some moderate intensity training in the same session. That moderate intensity session beforehand might even serve as like a good warm up if you're doing 30 to 45, maybe even like 60 minutes to do that. And there don't seem to be detriments, I guess. You're not ruining your zone 2 session by doing the HIIT at the end of it, because you've already gained the benefits of doing your low to moderate intensity, and then you're ending with the lactate elevating, the heart rate elevating type of exercise. So you're getting the benefits of both. And I think people could certainly structure their workout to do that, to optimize kind of both those benefits and fit it in if they're time limited.
I do love ending my run with a sprint.
Yeah, I do that a lot too. If I don't have a very structured interval workout during the week, which most weeks I do, I will throw in some very hard like sprints at the end of my run, or maybe run like the last couple miles of a run, like up tempo or something like that. So you definitely feel better. So again, going back to like the brain benefits, I think it just makes you, when you end with like your heart rate elevated, it feels a lot better. You don't feel as stale. But there might be some physiological benefits there too.
Yeah. Well, going back to our goals, I did mention brain health and lowering dementia risk. I often also a lot of my workouts are geared towards like brain health, and not even just thinking about long-term brain health and, delaying dementia, delaying brain atrophy, delaying all those, brain age-related diseases, but also just like mental health, like how I feel and feeling good. And it's clear to me, like after I do a HIIT or also a very long, if I do a much longer, more steady state sort of run, I also get a lot of really great feelings from that as well. Structuring the amount of, let's say, low to moderate intensity or zone 2. I know we're not measuring lactate directly, but let's call it that, versus your high intensity interval training. A lot of people out there, you'll see on a lot of platforms, people say 80-20, right? 80% of your exercise workout should be like low to moderate, 20% should be high intensity. Dr. Gibala talked a little bit about this, the distribution, the weekly training volume, how someone who is not like yourself, endurance athlete, do they need to follow this 80-20 rule, or how should that does that distribution change?
It definitely should. I think Dr. Gibala kind of made that clear in the conversation with you. It's interesting because I'm interested in this as myself, as I, not only looked at my own training, but how to prescribe training and talk about like training for people on the internet. But the origins of kind of the 80-20 are interesting. And it was basically just looking at the training logs of elite athletes and seeing what they do. When you broke it down basically by intensity, 80% of their sessions tended to be in this lower zone 2-ish intensity. And then 20% of the sessions appeared to be in the higher intensity training. And the important thing I think to note was that it's not necessarily based on time, but rather sessions per week. So say you're doing 5 training sessions per week. One of those, if you're following the 80-20, one of those would be high intensity. 4 of those would be moderate intensity. So it's the number of days versus the total amount of time spent, which kind of makes it easier, I think, for people to think about versus, sitting down and calculating how much time you spent in each of the heart rate zones, which is kind of difficult. Not many people are going to do that. So yeah, I think that the 80-20 breakdown, it works great if you're doing, maybe 8 hours or more kind of aerobic exercise per week. But when you were discussing with Martin Gibala, he seemed to be pretty convinced, as am I, that, if once your exercise volume starts decreasing kind of below maybe, 5 to 6 hours per week, or getting a little bit below that, you can probably afford to skew that a little more in favor of high intensity training then. So maybe you're doing something like a 70-30 or a 60-40. I mean, most people probably shouldn't do more than 2 high intensity interval training sessions per week. But again, that's going to depend on like how long are your high intensity training sessions. I mean, you and I were talking when creating this guide, and you talk about how, you might do 3 high intensity sessions per week, but they're only, and I say only, but 10 minutes long. So sure, you're doing HIIT 3 times per week, but they're very short. They're kind of for the brain boost that you get, and it doesn't seem to be unsustainable because you've been doing it for long. So obviously that's anecdotal, but yeah, I think if you're doing less, if you're doing 1 to 4 maybe hours per week, you should be less concerned with am I spending 80% of my training time doing zone 2? You could probably do a little bit more high intensity. And in fact, you might need to do more high intensity based on things like citations from Dr. Ben Levine on studies where if you want to get the same benefits of doing 8 to 10 hours of moderate intensity, you need to do the 1 to 4 hours need to be a higher intensity to equate basically your training volume. So I think if people are a little bit time limited and still want to gain the benefits of maybe doing a little bit more moderate intensity training volume, you can certainly do a little bit more HIIT. So maybe that looks like, again, say somebody's doing 5 training sessions per week, but they're doing 1 to 5 hours total. Maybe 2 of those sessions can be high intensity versus be 1. I don't see an issue with that. Again, I think everybody should, based on your training history and your experience, you don't want to burn out or risk injury, but if your volume is low, I think you can afford to fit a little bit more high intensity training in there. And a lot of the evidence kind of would suggest that. I mean, granted, most of them are pretty short duration, but there are plenty of studies in exercise science where you take previously unfit people or people who aren't engaging in a lot of exercise, and for 8 to 12 weeks, they're doing maybe 2 of the Norwegian 4x4 training sessions per week, sometimes even 3 sessions per week. Now, do I think that's advisable? Probably not. Maybe it's not sustainable, but it's clear that they can do it, that they can do a couple of these training sessions per week without getting injured, and they receive massive benefits from that.
Yeah, maybe we should, that's a good segue into some of the high intensity interval training protocols that are evidence-based in terms of improving cardiorespiratory fitness, for example. And a lot of these protocols are also improve other parameters, which we're going to get into as well, like mitochondrial density, as well as other metabolic benefits. But the Norwegian 4x4, so this is probably one of the, it's a very well-studied protocol where Dr. Levine talked about it, Dr. Kabbalah talked about it. People are doing 4 different intervals. So they're doing for 4 minutes, they are exercising typically on a stationary bike, perhaps a rowing machine. You could do it on a treadmill as well. But a lot of the protocols were on a bike. And you're doing for the 4-minute interval, you're going at an intensity that you can maintain for that entire 4 minutes. That's pretty hard. So it's pretty much a sustainable hard intensity for 4 minutes. It's obviously not going to be maximal, but you're going as hard as you can and as hard as you can sustain for that 4 minutes. And then you follow that by a 3-minute recovery period, which is very light, right? You want your heart rate to come down. You want to clear your lactate. And then you go back into the 4-minute interval. So that's a 4x4. You're doing it 4 times. That's a very good protocol to improve cardiorespiratory fitness. There's a variety of other protocols out there. Dr. Kabbalah mentioned. So there's the 1 minute on, 1 minute off, and you do that 10 times. So that the 10-minute workout, well, it's actually 20 minutes, but 10 minutes of more high intensity training, where again, for that entire minute, you're going as hard as you can sustain for that minute, right? It's not going to be all out, but it's as hard as you can go and sustain that for a minute. And then you rest and recover for a minute at very, very low intensity exercise. And then there's things like even Tabatas. So Tabata would be a 20-second on, 10-second off. You do that 8 times. The 20 seconds, you're really going as hard as you can, because 20 seconds is, it's not long, although it seems long when you're going as hard as you can. It actually seems quite long.
And the recovery intervals seem too short.
They're very,
hard portions seem longer than 20, and the recovery is like over before you know it.
Exactly. And there's a variety of other protocols out there as well. But we were talking a lot about even just adding a little like higher intensity workout at the end of a run. Do the intervals necessarily have to be 85% of your max heart rate?
I think for most people, it probably doesn't matter. You shouldn't focus on heart rate. It's just if you're going hard and your heart rate is elevated above the moderate intensity, you could probably call that high intensity interval training, and you use that to say that was my 1 HIIT session per week. I think, again, I mean, heart rate training, I'm not sure how many people actually use it. I know in any study that you use, an exercise physiology study, they'll have measures of heart rate because, you have physiologists on the side measuring your heart rate during exercise. But I can't tell you the last time I really looked at my heart rate or what percent of my heart rate I was at during exercise. I'm typically just basing it off of RPE, and I'm looking at my heart rate after the fact. So I think that you can pick an interval workout if you want to do the 4x4, if you want to do the 10x1, or if you want to do Tabata. One, looking at your heart rate the entire time is going to be distracting. Focus on the workout. So I think going at hard intensity, like you said, an intensity that you think seems sustainable for 4 minutes, and doing that. Once you get more familiar with the exercise, you may then be able to know that, if I'm going at however many watts, maybe 120 watts, and this is kind of my 85% max heart rate, you can use that to kind of guide your training. But in general, again, I think most people aren't going to be looking at their heart rate the entire time. So we're talking about what your heart rate should be at, but it's just go at a hard intensity. And for most people, that's going to be enough to get the benefits of high intensity interval training, which I think is important because a lot of the time we get caught up in, what's my heart rate? And if you're going hard, whether you're going hard or not. And that can be fine, I think, for most people to train.
Right. And again, going back to what we were talking about earlier and what Dr. Levine and the Kabbalah were mentioning about just mixing it up and giving that little extra stressor so that you get those adaptations, right? You don't want to keep doing the same thing. So sometimes even just doing something a little bit harder in your, normal sort of low to moderate intensity workout is beneficial, right?
Definitely. And I think, with the training, I think there are some people who like to do, I want to just do the Norwegian 4x4 every week. It's easy. I know what to do. I'm kind of familiar with it. But I think to not only avoid kind of like stagnation or maybe just getting bored of like the workout, but to stress your system in different ways. We just mentioned 3 protocols. Obviously, those aren't the only protocols. They're not necessarily the best, but just do different length of intervals every week. And I think that can be fun. There's something that I try to do in my own training. So maybe somebody picks the 4x4. This week, you're going to do 4x4. Next week, you're doing 10x1. The next week, you do a Tabata. So then you have 3 different lengths. You're doing the 4 minutes, which seem particularly good for improving like VO2 max, the like 2 to 4 minute range for intervals. You're doing the 10x1 again, which is, 1 minute long. And then you're doing the 20 seconds, which is your super kind of your sprint interval training, as maybe Dr. Kabbalah might refer to it. So mixing those things up, I think, can not only be enjoyable, but then you're hitting really all the body's like energetic systems, which can be fun as well.
Yeah, for sure. Mixing it up, that's something I do as well. Although I do have wonderful coaches that work with me, and they're very great at mixing up my routine, and it's very nice. But if it's just me left on my own device, I usually get on my Peloton and I'll do a Tabata, and it's the same, almost the same exact class that I have been doing for years. But sometimes we're just creatures of habit, and it's easy to kind of go back to the thing that So this, I think, is a good transition point. So we talked a lot about improving cardiorespiratory fitness and the benefits of that and the different types of training to help improve cardiorespiratory fitness based on a lot of what the experts have talked about on the podcast and their research. I want to remind people that they can find all of that information along with a variety of protocols for improving cardiorespiratory fitness in our How to Train guide according to the experts, and you can download that right now at howtotrainguide.com. We are going to move on to the next section, which is very interesting as well, and is also related to cardiovascular health. But it really is an area that is kind of neglected in a way, and I would say in popular media with respect to cardiovascular health, and that is the youthful structure of the heart and maintaining that youthful structure of the heart, which is really important for its function. It's important for preventing cardiovascular disease. It's even important for performance, being able to have a good aerobic capacity as you're getting older. So Dr. Ben Levine is really, I would consider him one of the world's leading experts in this area. And it was just a great privilege having him on the podcast. I just learned a tremendous amount of information. I didn't even really know much about how the structure of the heart changes with age, and until I was diving into his research and had him on the podcast. And he was talking about how as we age, our heart becomes stiffer at around early middle age. So this is like around, I guess it's more like 35 to 50 years of age. Crazy to think about that as being early middle age. Your heart starts to get stiffness, and that affects cardiac compliance. It affects hypertension. And part of that reason that it gets stiffer has to do with glucose regulation. And so when we're eating a variety of foods, particularly foods that are refined carbohydrates, refined sugars, and there's a elevation in our blood glucose levels that can be sustained for longer periods because perhaps there's a refined sugar or something that we're eating a lot, and maybe we're not exercising. That's the key. If we're sedentary, that glucose stays around in your vascular system, and it reacts with proteins, including collagen, which is lining our blood vessels. It's lining our myocardium, our pericardium, right? This is where our heart is. And that collagen, when it reacts with glucose in the Maillard reaction, it causes the collagen to become stiffer. And so that affects the stiffness of our vascular system, of our heart, and also our blood vessels. As we start to get into late middle age, this would be like 50 to 65, in addition to our heart getting stiffer, our heart shrinks, so it atrophies. And so our heart is getting smaller and it's getting stiffer, and these sorts of structural changes are affecting our cardiovascular health and our cardiovascular performance, right? Dr. Levine has done a whole lot of research, lots of different studies trying to identify how much exercise, what exercise is doing to the structure of the heart, for one, and how much exercise is really needed to help really stave off a lot of those changes, those structural changes with age. And he had one of the studies that he had done early on, which were done in masters athletes. They are physically active every single day, and they're competing at a national level in many cases. So they're doing a lot of cardiovascular and aerobic exercise. Their hearts structurally, so we're talking about seniors, so these are people that are older, their hearts looked like healthy 30-year-olds. So 30-year-olds that don't have any identifiable diseases like cardiovascular disease or type 2 diabetes or hypertension, right? And so that's pretty profound when you're talking about, a 50, 60-year-old person's structure, at least looking very similar to what a healthy 30-year-old would look. But we're not all going to be endurance athletes and masters athletes throughout our lives. So the next question is, well, what is the exercise dose that's really needed to get you most of the way there, to maintain that youthful cardiovascular structure? And that's where some of Dr. Levine's follow-up studies have looked at some of that research. Maybe you can talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I think some of this might be kind of maybe not surprising to a lot of people, but I think based on, everything he said, it seems like the dose appears to be maybe a little bit more, a little bit higher than a lot of people think it might be. And one of the things I think too, to add when you were talking about the changes that occur kind of across the lifespan, one of the, I think, craziest statistics that Dr. Levine cited was that after the age of 70, it became nearly impossible to reverse the structure of the heart, indicating that, you basically need to do everything that you can before that age to improve the structure of your heart, because after that, it takes an unsustainable maybe level of exercise to kind of reverse some of those structural changes, which I found very informative in related to, how to train with age. So in the study that he was citing during your interview, he mentioned, they did a study, an observational study where people self-reported their levels of physical activity kind of throughout their life, and they bucketed them into different days of activity. So this wasn't necessarily studying the dose in hours or minutes per week, but they looked at people exercising 1 to 2 days per week, 2 to 3 days per week, 3 to 4 days per week, 4 to 5, and then 5 to 6 or more days per week. And this was kind of a lifetime of physical activity. So how long have you exercised? How many days do you exercise per week for how long? And then they compared these levels of exercise to people who were sedentary, who basically didn't exercise at all. And so what they found was that the people who exercised 1 to 2 days per week pretty much had hearts with the same structure as sedentary adults. So 1 to 2 days per week provided zero protection basically against heart aging. When you moved up to 2 to 3 and then 3 to 4 days per week, those groups had some protection compared to the sedentary adults for their heart structure. So structure of their hearts were a little bit better than people who were sedentary. The 4 to 5 group, that's kind of when you experienced a significant level of cardiovascular protection with age. And then the 5 to 6 day per week exercisers had nearly complete protection. So they were similar to the masters athletes. And so what the conclusion from that study was, from Dr. Levine, was 4 to 5 days of exercise appears to be the optimal dose across the lifespan to prevent cardiovascular aging. Now, again, this study didn't provide a number on how many hours or minutes per week you should exercise, but let's assume these people were exercising for 30 minutes, maybe an hour per day when they were doing it. That puts you in the sweet spot of like maybe 5 to 6 hours per week of exercise. But that 4 to 5 days appears to be important. And so maybe you don't even think about how much time the people were spending in that, doing exercise, but just the frequency of exercise. Make sure you're doing, and when we say exercise here, we're referring to aerobic training in addition to resistance training, which we'll obviously dive deep into later, but this is just aerobic exercise. And again, that could be walking, that could be activity that raises your heart rate, dynamic exercise that raises your heart rate. But doing 4 to 5 days per week of that seems to be optimal for preserving cardiovascular structure. And I think the takeaway from that was really probably the 150 minutes per week that is cited as the minimum recommendation. It might not be enough if the goal is to kind of maintain cardiovascular structure throughout life.
And I'll tell you, this study was a bit surprising to me, because probably for that reason where, you think the 150 minutes a week or even just 3 days a week of aerobic exercise oh, you think you're doing really good, and I absolutely increased my frequency of aerobic exercise after hearing about this, because I was like, oh wow, I need to be doing more. I can do more. I should do more. And now I have evidence of why I need to do more, right? But it was a bit surprising where it's like, okay, if 4 to 5 days a week of aerobic exercise, then you're not quite at the master's athlete level in terms of your heart structure, but you're mostly there. And I do think 4 to 5 days a week is pretty sustainable for most people. It should be.
Yeah, it should be. And if it's not, maybe you need to make it in your structure your life in such a way that it should be. Dr. Levine had a great quote where he says, exercise needs to be part of your personal hygiene. It's like brushing your teeth. You wake up, it's not something that you think, oh, should I do this? It's, I'm going to wake up and I'm going to do this because it's part of your personal hygiene. And so I think there's a lot of talk sometimes about, if we prescribe the recommendations for exercise too high, does that deter people from doing it? And maybe, but the reality is, I think he presents compelling data that if we want to get serious about it and you're really serious about not aging cardiovascularly, like, you need to probably do more exercise. And so I think it's kind of a harsh reality, but just something for people to think about and how to structure their training.
It is a part of both of our personal hygiene, right? When you wake up in the morning, what's the first thing you do? I'm not first thing, but like in terms of work versus exercise.
Oh, it's definitely exercise.
Exercise.
Drink coffee and exercise.
Yeah. Exercise is the first thing I do. I brush my teeth and I eat a little bit, but I do, before I work, in most cases, I exercise. And that wasn't always the case for me. Even dating back to when have been very interested in my health span and lifespan, it was like, okay, I'm working 4 days a week, or no, now it's 6 days. It is every morning, and if I take off an hour of what would be my work time, so be it, because that's what's going to happen. I'm going to exercise.
Yeah, you make the time for it, and that has to be the case a lot. I think the paradox kind of is that most people tend to exercise more when they're younger, which is kind of when you need less exercise. I think as you get older, you probably need to do more exercise. And that's, I think, what the evidence that Dr. Levine presents would indicate too. But I also feel like as people get older, they might have a little bit more free time. Once you get into your 40s and 50s and 60s, you're reaching, your kids are out of the house, you're maybe still working a job. But once you get into retirement age, so maybe, I think the way that maybe people think about exercising is that, you want to do a lot in early life to kind of build up those reserves in your muscle mass and your aerobic fitness and things like that. But, as you get older, think about exercising more as you maybe have more time to dedicate to it, because not only, you need probably that amount in order to kind of maintain some of these changes. So it's, again, I think a harsh reality maybe.
Well, let's talk a little bit about some of Dr. Levine's research on starting into that late middle age 50. And this was he calls it one of the most cited or viewed on the website in the journal Circulation Studies of all time, and rightly so. I think it's a pretty astounding study. It was a 2-year intervention trial where him and his colleagues took 50-year-olds that were otherwise healthy but sedentary. I would argue that's not healthy if they're sedentary. It is a disease, but they don't have any other identified diseases like cardiovascular disease or hypertension, for example. But they had been sedentary. And he put them on a 2-year exercise protocol, which maybe you can discuss in a minute, that was pretty intense. And they looked at the structure of their heart before starting this protocol. And then 2 years after this exercise protocol, they looked at their hearts again and found that in many aspects, like the cardiac compliance and a variety of different parameters that they looked at, the size of the heart and the stiffness, right, the stretchiness of the heart, in many aspects had reversed in terms of their aging. In fact, it was comparable. Their hearts were comparable to looking more like 30-year-olds. So they had essentially started this program, and they had these 50-year-old looking hearts, and with respect to the size and the compliance. And then after this 2-year exercise protocol had reversed 20 years of cardiac aging, which is pretty astonishing and inspirational in many respects. So the protocol wasn't necessarily easy, though.
It wasn't at all. It was I think it wasn't easy. It was simple. And I think something that everybody can kind of work up to and use as kind of a framework for how to structure their training. So yeah, as you mentioned, this was a 2-year study, which again, like if anybody's familiar with exercise physiology research, like doing a 2-year exercise intervention is pretty incredible to get those participants to adhere to that regimen. I can't remember how many participants were in that study right now, but I think it was, somewhere around 200 maybe, but they had a pretty decent number of participants. But it involved a 2-year commitment, and they didn't start them out right away doing everything that they were doing at the end, but they scaled up their exercise gradually throughout the 2 years. By year 1, they were kind of, reaching their peak exercise, and then they maintained them for the second year. And so what this involved was eventually, doing about 5 to 6 hours of aerobic exercise, or I guess it was total training per week was kind of 5 to 6 hours. And what that involved was one Norwegian 4x4 session. They actually, at one point in the study, just before the 1 year mark, were doing 2 Norwegian 4x4 interval training sessions per week. After the year, they dropped it down to just 1 for the maintenance phase. So 1 Norwegian 4x4 interval training session per week. They did 1 session per week that was an hour or longer of their base pace. So we could refer to that as low to moderate intensity exercise, zone 2 training, but it was like a 1 hour longer base pace session. And that could be just a bike, a run, a walk, a hike, something like that. And then they did another 30-minute base pace session per week. So another zone 2 exercise training session per week. They also did a very light recovery day after all of their interval training sessions. So the day after their Norwegian 4x4, they did a light active recovery day. And then they did 2 resistance training exercise sessions per week. So they were doing 4 aerobic training sessions, 2 resistance exercise training sessions for the protocol. And again, they scaled up to that. So this wasn't, we're doing a 4x4 all at once, but they progressively, added that for the first year. By the end of the second year, they were maintaining that. So they, for 2 years did about 5 to 6 hours of exercise. And like you mentioned, they reversed their certain aspects of their cardiovascular structure by, an estimated 20 years, which is pretty astounding. So yeah, not an easy protocol, but certainly not something like a high-level elite endurance athlete is doing. So it's something that everybody, I think, could do. And these were people who were 50, 60 years old.
Right. It's doable. Mm. And I'd be curious to know how many of those people continue to maintain that after the study was over, knowing they reversed their heart aging in terms of the structural aging of their heart by almost, about 20 years. I feel like that would be very motivating for any 50 or 60-year-old to go, wow, I should keep this up. This is like, I want my heart to stay like a 30-year-old, right? I mean, that, yeah, for me, it would, for sure.
It would be cool to see a follow-up study. It would also just be cool to see if they didn't maintain that training, they just totally stopped, how long those benefits kind of lasted. I think that would be interesting too. And if I know Dr. Levine and them have follow-up studies on some of the exercise training, but it would be interesting to see for that one, because I'm sure you can maintain some of those benefits for a few years, but the bed rest training study or just some of the studies on detraining, you see like kind of once you stop, it's a very steep slope down back to where you were.
Right. Especially with respect to your cardiorespiratory fitness.
Certainly.
Right? Yeah. Well, a lot of this research, so this intervention study, we're talking about the masters athletes looking at identifying, I called it the dose, but it really is in terms of frequency, how many days a week you have to work out to kind of help maintain that youthful cardiac structure, has led Dr. Levine to have what he calls his prescription for life with respect to exercise. He does add a little bit of resistance training into that prescription for life. Maybe we can talk a little bit about that and then talk about our prescription for life, like what our protocols are.
His prescription for life was honestly one of, I think, my favorite takeaways from that episode, because it was something that I felt was reasonable for everybody. It's a lot more exercise than probably most people are doing, but not something that everyone couldn't work up to at some point. And so his prescription for life was very similar to kind of that 2-year training study that he cited. He cited the sweet spot of 4 to 5 days per week of aerobic exercise or 5 to 6 hours per week of training. That seems to be kind of the sweet spot. Performing interval training once per week. And, while in that study, they used the Norwegian 4x4, you could do any type of intervals. We just mentioned a few other protocols, the 10x1, the Tabata, but really just do some type of high intensity interval training once per week. After every high intensity interval training session, take a light recovery day. Levine definitely stressed the importance of recovery, not only just from a muscular perspective and your autonomic nervous system, but the cardiac and cardiovascular system also needs to recover. When you stress it with a high heart rate, you do increase some markers of like cardiac damage, and those also need time to recover. So if you're doing interval workout, the next day, doing 30 or more maybe minutes of very light activity. That's also kind of part of his prescription. His 1 hour or longer base pace session per week was definitely kind of a foundation of his prescription. And then the 2 or more resistance training session exercises per week, which, this is a very, very practical approach. And I think most people could, maybe you should just take this and paste it up on your wall and use that to guide your training every week. I think if most people did that, they would be certainly in a good place, not only to, I think, age better, but the way I see it, I look at Levine's prescription for life and it mirrors a lot of like what I do for my weekly training. The way I structure kind of my training, I have one long run for every single week. I do probably 2 easy zone 2 exercise sessions. I do 1 high intensity interval session, and then I try to strength train twice per week. So I really follow Levine's prescription for life. I just kind of scale it up to meet the volume that I'm seeking per week. And so I'm sure you, Rhonda, probably do something similar to that.
Well, what's your total hours?
I would say on the typical week, I'm probably exercising like 14 to 16 hours. Most of it's endurance. So I'll probably do 14 hours of endurance training and then, getting in like 1 to 2 hours of strength training. I could probably veer more towards the strength training. But again, it's, as we talked about earlier, what I'm trying to optimize for at this point in my life.
Yeah. Well, I'm not clocking in quite as many hours. I'm doing more like 6 to 6.5 hours a week, depending on the week. So I end up doing a more high intensity training and a little bit more. I would say that zone 3 is probably a big part of my training. So I do 3 days a week. I'm doing. It's sort of it's more like a CrossFit type of training where I'm doing a combination of, I do strength. Well, 2 of those days I do strength training for about 30 minutes each. So it's about an hour of strength training a week. And then I do a little bit of hypertrophy training as well. And then followed by like a 15-minute high intensity interval training that includes some aerobic as well. So it'll be something like I'll do like the rowing machine or the bike or jumping rope. And then I'll add in something like, lighter weight squats or push-ups or dips or lunges. And, so it's like a combination of, and that's for the remaining like 30 minutes. So that would be like an hour a week of that. And then I do another hour of something kind of similar, but it includes a little bit more aerobic. So it's a combination of things as well, where I'm also doing things like lunges and I'm doing weights and I'm doing hypertrophy training. Not as much strength training, but then I'm combining it with a rowing machine. I'm doing a salt bike. I'm doing the skier or jumping rope. So it's a very efficient way for me to get that strength training, my resistance training, and also some high intensity interval training in there. In addition to that, I'll do about an hour a week of, I do some zone 2 into zone 3 runs, probably more zone 3-ish, where I'm not really talking. It's very breathy of a talk, right? And then I'll do some sprinting towards the end of that. And then 1 day a week. So that's like, this is all like, that's twice a week I do that. And then on my 6th day, which is typically a weekend, I'll do hiking for like 1.5 hours to 2 hour hike with my family. And we're walking, of course, and it is hiking. So we walk up hills, but sometimes we do some sprints and race each other and stuff in the middle of that. But it's not like really super intense. I do consider it more of a recovery day because the walk is just very long and it's over an hour. So it meets that box with what Dr. Levine said. He should do something once a week that is at least an hour long. He doesn't care what it is as long as it's fun and you enjoy it. I enjoy the hikes, and he said you could even be walking. It could be a walk. So that's kind of my typical week's workout as well.
I think what you said about enjoyment was kind of important too, and something we sometimes don't talk about. We're getting very technical about like how people should train, but yeah, find something. He even stressed that the hour long session, it doesn't need to be a bike ride or a run. It can be a hike. It could be, I think he even said something like a dance. If you go to a dance class and are dancing for an hour, well, if your heart rate's elevated, that works. Maybe you're skiing. So just something where you're doing a cardiovascular type exercise for an hour or more, because I think the key with his prescription was it needs to be sustainable, because that's literally the whole idea, his prescription for life. This is something that you can do whether you're 30 years old or starting at 30 all the way up until you're 70 or 80. So I think that's important too, to have activities that you enjoy doing.
Right. For me also, accountability is important. So I do work with coaches. I have a really great coach that comes and works with me on my strength training and CrossFit type of training. And then I go and work out with friends as well. And there's that fun group aspect. Going to a gym, maybe that has classes. I mean, that's another way. Something that's going to keep you going back, right? So it does have to be sustainable. It has to be something that you enjoy. I don't necessarily enjoy strength training, and we can talk a little bit more about this when we get into that part. I mean, it's very hard, and there's a lot of surprising aspects of it that I didn't quite expect after I really started engaging in that. But it helps to have a coach, or certainly even just going to a class, right, where there is a coach. It doesn't have to be a personal trainer, but whatever it is that you decides best for you. With that said, I would like to move on to some of the metabolic effects and adaptations that occur with aerobic exercise. So fundamental to metabolic health is mitochondrial health. And mitochondria, for most people who aren't aware of what these are, they're little tiny organelles that are inside of our cells, most of our cells, with the exception of red blood cells, that are creating energy from the food that we eat, carbohydrates, fatty acids. They're very important for a variety of metabolic functions and everything from neurotransmitter synthesis, brain function, to muscle function, to cardiac function. Our mitochondria are at the center of everything. So you really want to do what you can to preserve and improve mitochondrial health. There's a lot of interest in improving mitochondrial health and what types of training protocols are best for improving mitochondrial health. And when Dr. Martin Gibala was on the podcast, I was asking him about high intensity interval training and how that compared to more of a zone 2, like continuous exercise type of training in terms of improving mitochondrial health. And he basically said that when the volume of exercise is kept the same, that mitochondrial density, so this is mitochondrial biogenesis, which is the creation of new mitochondria, was actually better after high intensity interval training than more zone 2, low to moderate intensity type of training when the volume of exercise was the same. Now, again, as we mentioned earlier, you're most of the time going to be doing a larger volume of exercise of a zone 2 type of training versus high intensity interval training. So it becomes a more time efficient way of getting some similar benefits, metabolic benefits and mitochondrial benefits as a zone 2 type of training would get. So with respect to mitochondrial biogenesis, mitochondrial density, also a process known as mitophagy. So this is the clearing away of damaged mitochondria. As we age, our mitochondria become damaged. We don't have a repair system we don't have a DNA repair system. We have DNA in our mitochondria, but we don't have the same types of repair systems as we do in our nuclear genome. So mitochondria repair themselves through a variety of mechanisms. One of them is mitophagy, where a portion of the mitochondria will be recycled, or perhaps even the entire mitochondria if the entire mitochondria is damaged. It seems as though the more vigorous the exercise, the more intense the exercise, the increased prevalence that you have of mitophagy happening. So again, it doesn't mean that zone 2 type of training isn't having that happen as well, but you probably just have a larger volume of that before you get there. So then there's this whole area of fat burning, and you discussed this a little bit earlier, and Dr. Gibala discussed this, where what type of exercise is better for fat burning, right? Well, mitochondria are at the center of burning fat, right? So fatty acids are oxidized in the mitochondria. So you hear a lot about zone 2 training and how zone 2 training is really ideal for optimizing fat burning. Maybe you can talk a little bit about, maybe recap a little bit about what Dr. Gibala was saying with respect to how high intensity interval training affects fat utilization and how that compares to perhaps a low to moderate intensity type of training like zone 2 training.
I think there's no question that zone 2 training, as we mentioned before, during zone 2 training, while you're actually exercising, fat oxidation is maximized. So you're burning more fat during zone 2 training, at least as a relative, percentage of total contribution versus carbohydrates, compared to like a higher intensity interval training. But when you were talking with Dr. Martin Gibala and you asked him, does the substrate that you are utilizing most during exercise kind of predict the adaptation in that? And his answer, and what the literature would show, is that fatty acid oxidation relies on your mitochondrial content, as well as your levels of this enzyme known as CPT, or carnitine palmitoyl transferase, which is the rate limiting enzyme for getting fatty acids into the mitochondria where they can be oxidized to produce energy. So any exercise or, the exercise that improves CPT enzyme levels and mitochondrial content the most is going to enhance your fat oxidation capacity the most. And the evidence is pretty clear based on what I've been reading in certain meta-analyses that would show high intensity training compared to moderate or low intensity training. It increases mitochondrial content more, it increases CPT enzyme levels and activity more. So, and it also leads to better fat oxidation capacity. So even though you're not burning more fat during high intensity training, your mitochondria are adapting in such a way to allow you to burn more fat or due to exercise training. So, which is interesting, and not to say that you don't need zone 2, but I think that it goes to show that maybe, if your goal is to become a better fat burner, that high intensity interval training might actually be, when it's volume matched, just as good, if not a little bit better than moderate intensity training. And it all comes back to the mitochondria. HIIT is a potent stimulator of mitochondrial biogenesis and all of these mitochondrial enzymes, as is zone 2, but HIIT might be a little bit better if volume matched again. It's always key to kind of note that.
Right. It comes down to that adaptation, right? When you're pushing beyond the capacity of your body's ability to bring nutrients and oxygen to the mitochondria to be oxidized for energy, and you start going into that, zone 3, zone 4, where you're using glucose and producing lactate as a byproduct, your body is going, oh, I need to increase my mitochondrial density so that I can start using my mitochondria, right? It's an adaptation. It's a response to that stressor. And I think the other thing that people often think about is always like this black and white thinking, right? There's this bin and that bin, as to use Dr. Layne Norton's analogy, where people think if you're doing high intensity interval training, you're just burning glucose and producing lactate. And that's just not the case. In fact, the majority of the time, even when you're doing a high intensity interval training workout, you're doing both, right? You're not just burning. I mean, unless someone's doing like an all out Wingate, which I don't know many people that have done that. I certainly haven't ever done one, but you're not really going to be just only burning glucose, right? There's a gray area. So you're also still using your mitochondria to some degree as well.
Totally. Yeah, I think sometimes, especially going back to when we were talking about zones, people talk about zones as if they're these very neat buckets. Well, I'm in zone 2 now, and then if I get a little bit harder, I like flip across this threshold into zone 2 and then into zone 3. But it's more of a spectrum versus a black and white jumping into these different buckets of zones or what we're using as a fuel source during exercise. Yeah, it's definitely more like a spectrum than a threshold that you cross and you're using one or the other.
Why do people, why is there a, you can see it circulating around on social media and the blogosphere, podcasts. If you're doing zone 2 training, you're going to be a better fat burner. Like you ask someone why I'm doing zone 2 training because I want to be a better quote unquote fat burner. What does that even mean? Is that even true? And I've also seen studies where it seems as though doing more high intensity interval training, more vigorous exercise, people end up burning more fat after the exercise, if they're doing that type of exercise versus low to moderate intensity training.
I think for something like weight loss or body composition, I think diet is probably the biggest lever you can pull for that. And people will say, oh, exercise is not great for weight loss. But, there is a contribution of exercise to weight loss. And for high intensity training, there does seem to be, you're burning a lot of fat during exercise. There's this quote unquote afterburn effect that I know Dr. Martin Gabala talked about where, maybe several hours after exercise, you kind of have this higher caloric burn or this higher fat burn. So if you're interested in, improving body composition, you kind of want to become a better fat burner and burn more fat during exercise to help you improve your body composition. I think, what it means to become a better fat burner is kind of nuanced and maybe not as understood. But I think this idea, one, is of metabolic flexibility. And so people may have heard this term before, but it essentially refers to the fact that, let's say you're in between meals or you're fasting overnight and you wake up in the morning, like metabolic flexibility just reflects your ability to, when glucose is low or glycogen stores are low, kind of switch over to using fatty acids or oxidizing fat for energy. So you can use both fuel sources kind of interchangeably and use them well because you have like the cellular and metabolic machinery to do that. But what it also means from a kind of performance and athletic perspective is that you're able to use fat as a fuel source at an increasingly higher intensity. So most people may be aware that once you start exercising more at a higher and higher intensity, you use more carbohydrate or more glucose as an energy source compared to fat. So if you read like a classic exercise physiology textbook, there's always this graph where exercise intensity is on the x-axis. So it goes from 0, which is resting, to 100, maximal intensity exercise. And then on the y-axis is another 0 to 100%. And that's your contribution of glucose and fat to your energy. And so at rest, you're using, almost 100% maybe fat. And as you increase your exercise intensity, fat oxidation goes down, carbohydrate oxidation goes up. And then kind of in the middle, somewhere about 60, 70% of your maximal heart rate, that's where, you're getting 50% contribution from carbohydrate, 50% from fat. And so essentially, if you are a better fat burner, those are shifted a little bit. So the slope of those lines is kind of reduced, whereas, maybe before your max fat oxidation occurred at 60% of your maximal exercise intensity. Well, now, if I become a better fat burner, when I'm at 80% of my maximal exercise intensity, that's where my maximal fat oxidation occurs. So you're using more fat at a higher exercise intensity. That is kind of from a performance or an athletics exercise perspective, what it means to become a better fat burner. And you can do that by doing fasted exercise. You can do it by doing zone 2, doing high intensity interval training, increasing your mitochondria. Eating a keto diet, there's like the famous study where they looked at people habitually eating a ketogenic diet and their max fat oxidation was at 85% of their exercise intensity, which is kind of high. So that's essentially what it means. What are the benefits? I mean, being a quote unquote glucose burner or a carb burner, when you use carbohydrates, you kind of produce reactive oxygen species, and maybe, that may be helpful for limiting those kind of byproducts. For performance, it can help you not have to fuel as much during exercise. If your body can use fat, you don't necessarily have to keep replenishing and keep your blood glucose high using exogenous kind of like drinks or gels or something like that. That's kind of from an athletics or performance perspective. So I think those are some of the main benefits. And, not everybody's goal is to become a better fat burner, but there seem to be benefits both for health and longevity to doing so.
Metabolic flexibility, I mean, there's definitely longevity benefits for that. And to get that metabolic flexibility, it sounds like, you don't necessarily have to be just a zone 2 trainer. Like you can do high intensity interval training. Again, you're increasing your mitochondrial density. There's a lot of different ways to get there in terms of aerobic exercise. It doesn't have to necessarily just be zone 2, which is where some of the, like you hear some people and I think there's a misconception where it's like, oh, I have to be in the zone 2 where I'm only burning fatty acids and not shifting into that more intense zone where I'm burning glucose as well in order for me to become a fat burner. And I don't know that that's necessarily the case.
No, I don't think so. And, like we just said, because if you get better, more and healthier and, more efficient mitochondria, you're going to become a better fat burner. And there are multiple ways to improve the health of your mitochondria.
Right.
Just zone 2 exercise.
Right. Well, shifting gears and talking a little bit about glucose regulation. I mean, this is also a very important area for cardiovascular health. I mentioned that glucose dysregulation, if you're constantly having elevations in blood glucose levels, that can lead to the stiffening of your myocardium, of your pericardium, right? These have collagen in them and they react with glucose, and that leads to a lower cardiac compliance. Essentially, your heart is less stretchy. You want to maintain and improve your glucose regulation throughout your life. It's very important. This is where my conversation with Dr. Martin Gabala was really, I think, shed some light into the benefits of high intensity interval training on glucose regulation. Now, there's no doubt that aerobic exercise improves glucose regulation, like full stop. Like you're going to have improved glucose regulation if you are engaging in aerobic exercise. But if you're, again, comparing the volume of exercise being the same and comparing sort of a continuous lower to moderate intensity exercise with high intensity interval training or a more vigorous type of exercise, you're going to have more improvements in glucose regulation with the higher intensity exercise. And that somewhat has to do with the utilization of glucose, which produces lactate as a byproduct. It's not necessarily a byproduct. We know it's not a byproduct anymore. It's an active metabolite that is not only an energy source for mitochondria, it's also a signaling molecule. So in other words, it's a way for your muscles to communicate with your muscles and proteins in your muscles. It's also a way for your muscles to communicate with other organs like the brain and the heart and the liver and your kidneys. And so that lactate actually is a signaling molecule to the muscle cells, the glucose transporters in the muscle, then come up. It's called translocation. They come up to the cell surface of the muscle and they're open and primed and ready to take in a lot of glucose. And lactate's really key in that process. So if you're producing lactate by having a more intense workout, you're going to have more GLUT4 transporters that are translocating up to the muscle cell surface where they're ready to take in the glucose. So high intensity interval training is definitely a good way to improve glucose regulation. But the lactate isn't the only reason for that, right?
Yeah. So, lactate, obviously pretty important in that mechanism that you just referenced, but muscle contraction in and of itself is just so interesting in that it also causes those GLUT4 transporters to translocate to the cell membrane where they can suck up more glucose into the muscle. And so what high intensity interval training does that makes it more potent for doing that is it engages a larger amount of muscle mass. Like you mentioned, it increases our utilization of glucose in the skeletal muscle. So it kind of increases the sensitivity of the muscle to take up glucose because you're utilizing it. Larger amount of muscle mass, larger amount of glucose transporters, and more glucose taken up into the cell. So essentially, that's another reason I think why high intensity training and resistance training too, like we'll talk about later, but are great for glucose regulation, maybe much more so particularly compared to zone 2 training.
You're talking about engaging the muscles. There was a study that was published, not a few months ago. I mean, it was less than a year ago, that had compared doing 10 bodyweight squats to 30 minutes. So the 10 bodyweight squats over the span of an 8-hour work day, basically. So you're doing it every 45 minutes. So every 45 minutes, you do 10 bodyweight squats over 8 hours. And that was compared to a 30-minute continuous walk. And the bodyweight squats were more potent at improving glucose clearance than the continuous walk. Again, probably because lactate is being produced and you're engaging, like you're talking about, the muscles are being engaged more robustly than perhaps a walk would do. But also, Dr. Gvala talked about walking and continuous walking versus interval walking as well.
Yeah, and I think that the study that he was citing shows that just intensity matters, but also kind of just interval, kind of the interval pattern could be interesting for like regulating glucose. So yeah, he mentioned this study where they basically just did 2 groups of walking, where one walked at a continuous intensity of 65% and the other group alternated intensities of 75% and 60%. So not even high intensity interval training. They just did interval walking is what he called it. And they experienced much better improvements in, it was 24-hour glucose regulation and cardiometabolic risk factors. I think in things like waist circumference, their BMI, as well as like their HbA1c, all those things improved better with interval walking compared to just moderate intensity walking, even when they didn't do really high intensity. So there seems to be maybe something unique about the study that you mentioned, breaking up the activity throughout the day and then doing oscillating intervals, even if it's just walking for glucose regulation. So something to think about for people if glucose regulation is one of their goals.
Right. I like to do that. Again, like I mentioned with my hikes, we'll stop and we'll do some interval sprints. And of course, like throughout the day, it's nice. We'll talk a little bit about exercise snacks, but that's another way to kind of break up the sedentary part of your day. I want to shift gears and talk a little bit about, I'll just talk briefly about brain health, training for brain health. We cover a little bit in this guide as well. And Dr. Gabal and I talked a little bit about this as well. In fact, he just sent me a systematic analysis yesterday, a new study that came out on high intensity interval training and how it improves brain-derived neurotrophic factor. So brain-derived neurotrophic factor is a growth factor. It's a neurotrophic factor. It's produced in the body, in the muscle, but also in the brain. In the brain, it plays a very important role it helps the growth of new neurons in certain parts of the brain, like the substantia nigra, for example, the hippocampus. And it helps with the connections between neurons so that your synapses and your connections and your long-term potentiation, things that are forming long-term memory, are more solidified. It plays a role in neuroplasticity, the ability of your brain to sort of adapt to the changing environment, and a variety of other things that's doing in your brain. That's hugely beneficial for brain aging, for cognition. So you really want to increase brain-derived neurotrophic factor in the brain. There's been a variety of exercise protocols, high-intensity exercise protocols, vigorous exercise. It seems as though the more vigorous the intensity of the exercise, the more robust the brain-derived neurotrophic factor effect. And again, this comes down to lactate as well as other mechanisms. Lactate's one mechanism because lactate has been shown to cross over to the blood-brain barrier and in the brain activate brain-derived neurotrophic factor. So it's one of the ways your muscle communicates with the brain and tells the brain, because you're stressing your muscles, you're also stressing your brain at the same time. And so it's a response, an adaptation, the way your body is adapting and going, okay, I need to make sure I can handle this stress. Let's make more brain-derived neurotrophic factor so that I can handle that stress. Even the 10-minute high intensity interval training workout has been shown to improve cognition. I often like to do a 10-minute Tabata before I do something that I need to be sharp or focused on, like a podcast, for example, because it's a 10-minute workout. I mean, you have 10 minutes and you can do it. And I often feel really good after that. So we do cover some of that in the training guide as well. I think that the bottom line with protocols to improve brain-derived neurotrophic factor is intensity and also volume. So even if you're doing a 20-minute workout and you want to be at least like 80% your max heart rate for those 20 minutes, more like a zone 3-ish kind of workout, right? That's been shown to robustly increase brain-derived neurotrophic factor. If you double that to 40 minutes, then you get an even more robust increase.
I think a lot of people will probably just know that to be true anecdotally. I certainly know that if I do a longer, low to moderate intensity exercise, like 60 to 90 minutes, I feel good afterwards. My mind feels clear, but it's nothing like when I do a high intensity interval session where you sometimes feel like your brain is just like on fire. So I think a lot of people have the same experience where just low kind of steady state exercise, yeah, it feels good, but it really doesn't provide, I think, the cognitive improvement benefits acutely that high intensity training does. And I know that's something that you talk about a ton, and just how you structure your own HIIT protocols to really correspond with either your cognitive work that you're doing, because you really do, you just feel clear, you feel sharp after, you feel energized. So I really do think there's like nothing like HIIT to improve brain health, and obviously long-term brain health through exercise training, but just to use it acutely as well, just as like this kind of stimulant almost.
Right. I deliberately structure those short 10-minute HIIT workouts around times like this, like I have a podcast I'm going to do or a presentation I'm going to give, and I'm in a hotel and it's like I got to do my 10-minute high intensity workout. I often go to the gym and get on the bike and do something. That kind of is I think this is a good segue into these sort of exercise snacks. Now, some people would consider a 10-minute workout even on the longer end of an exercise snack. So exercise snacks they can be structured or unstructured. And I talked about this with Dr. Martin Gabala a lot. He's been involved in a lot of studies involving the unstructured type of exercise snacks. But the structured type of exercise snack is something where you're getting your heart rate really high, at least 80% of your max heart rate, right? You're getting more into that vigorous intensity zone. And it could be anywhere from 1 minute to 9 minutes, perhaps 10 minutes, where you're doing intervals, right? If you're doing a 10 minutes, not like the entire 10 minutes you're in that, but you're doing intervals. But if you're doing a 1 minute or 2 minute or 3 minute workout, then you can be in a pretty high 85% your max heart rate zone, right? So some examples would be something like bodyweight squats, or you do high knees or burpees or jumping jacks for some people, lunges, right? Something where you're engaging multiple muscle groups and you're also just getting your heart rate up as well. So those would be the structured types of exercise snacks. There's also the unstructured type where people just throughout their daily activities that they're doing will engage in an exercise snack. So these are called vigorous intermittent lifestyle physical activity, or VILPA. And this is typically someone who, let's say their office is on the 3rd or 4th floor of a building, and they sprint up the stairs. They go fast up the stairs. Maybe not technically sprint, because a coach would be like, no way. And you're right, but no way. But they're going fast. They're not just walking. They're going fast. Their heart rate's getting up. And they do that multiple times a day, or they walk, and instead of just walking, they're really briskly walking. They're going really fast, right? And there's other examples of this sort of unstructured type of, house cleaning sometimes, right? People are like going around and vacuuming and they're kind of fast. Like, I've seen that being the case as well. So there's a lot of types of unstructured exercise that can be done. And there's a variety of benefits that are associated with this sort of these exercise snacks. And with Dr. Gabala, when he came on the podcast, he was talking a lot about these VILPA studies where researchers give people that are engaging in this type of unstructured exercise an accelerometer. So this is measuring their heart rate, and they're able to see their heart rate and also like, I guess, the distance as well. But it's also measuring their heart rate, and they're seeing how high their heart rate goes. And then they've looked at a variety of outcomes, all-cause mortality, cardiovascular-related mortality, cancer-related mortality. And what these publications, which Dr. Gabala has been a part of, have shown is that people that are engaging in this type of VILPA exercise, this unstructured exercise, for 1 to 2 minutes, 3 times a day, so you're getting up to the 9-minute a day range, they have a 50% reduction in all-cause mortality, cardiovascular-related mortality, and a 40% reduction in cancer-related mortality. And these are benefits that are even found in people that identify as non-exercisers. So, in other words, they don't consider themselves, they don't go to the gym, they're not doing tennis or dance class or whatever. They consider themselves like not doing physical activity. So I think that data really kind of drives home that even these small sort of bursts of physical activity can be beneficial for health. Then there's also a lot of psychological benefits that Dr. Gabala talked about as well.
With the exercise snacks, it obviously, I think that psychologically, knowing that you have to just exercise for 1 to 2 minutes at a time, it feels easier. And so one of their, I think, goals with these exercise snacks and doing these actual studies was one of the barriers to exercise for some people is, I have to exercise for 30 to 40 minutes at a time. I don't really want to do that. Now, people should probably learn to do that, but, for people who may not comply with that, it feels psychologically easier than long workout, and they don't really require any special equipment. If you're doing them throughout the day while you're working at a job, you don't even have to change your clothes. And so it just removes that psychological barrier that I have to get dressed and go to the gym and exercise for 30 minutes at a time. With exercise snacks, you're doing it for 1 to 5 minutes and then it's over, and you just do it a few times per day. So psychologically, they feel easier. These consistent small efforts also appear to enhance adherence. And so when they conduct these studies, they find that adherence is pretty high as compared to maybe some of the exercise training studies where people don't necessarily do all the exercise that they're prescribed, especially if it's supposed to be at home and it's, it doesn't require them coming into the lab. So those are kind of two of the psychological benefits. And I think those can be leveraged by, again, maybe non-exercisers, but also people who exercise. But there are a lot of physiological benefits to the exercise snacks as well. I mean, there are multiple studies by Dr. Gabala and colleagues showing people improve their VO2 max just by doing these exercise snacks 4 to 5 times per day for a few times per week. They can improve cardiometabolic health, so they can improve their blood pressure, reduce their fasting blood glucose, improve their HbA1c, so measures of body composition, glucose regulation. All of these can improve with exercise snacks, which is profound, I think. One thing to note, I think, is that these people were previously untrained, so I don't think you can take somebody who's exercising at a level of maybe what you and I are doing, Rhonda, and do exercise snacks, and you're going to see these huge health benefits, especially like VO2 max. But I certainly think that they can be additive. So if you are exercising and you add these exercise snacks, you can receive additional health benefits, but you might not see a 50% improvement in your VO2 max by doing exercise snacks. But studies have shown that, and so I think they can be very potent in doing that as well, in showing that it doesn't require a large time investment just to see a fitness improvement. And then I think one of the other benefits is that they break up sedentary time throughout the day. So we know that being sedentary, sitting for, say, 30 to 60 minutes or longer, or maybe 3 hours at a time, is not good for cardiometabolic health. So breaking up your sedentary time as much as possible is good. And so physically, psychologically, just with the cognitive benefits too, using these exercise snacks intermittently throughout the day can improve physical health by reducing sedentary time and keeping more focused by reducing your kind of the cognitive maybe slump that you get after you sit for 3 hours or so at a time.
It also helps with the like midday slumpiness, like where you're feeling kind of sleepy. And I cannot drink caffeine afternoon. Like for me, it affects me. I'll be up too late in the evening. So I will get up and do some body weight squats. Usually it's body weight squats. Sometimes I'll do some push-ups or something, but something that just gets my heart rate up and blood flowing. And what do you know? I feel better, right? I'm ready. I'm more focused, ready to get back to work as well. And the other thing that's really good with the exercise snacks is to time them around meals. And there's also been some evidence on this published looking at mostly people with metabolic dysfunction like type 2 diabetes, metabolic syndrome, and how even doing something timed around a meal, and doesn't have to be long. It can be a short, again, you're doing some body weight squats or burpees or jumping jacks, whatever. It improves glucose regulation, right? And so it's something that I typically will do it if I'm going out to dinner, certainly when I'm on vacation and I don't eat the way I usually eat on my usual disciplined type of diet, where it's like, okay, we're in Italy and we're having gelato. Guess what? I'm like next to the gelato station and I'm doing body weight gelato. It's like, so, I mean, it's something that can be used as a tool for, like you mentioned, improving cardiometabolic health, and also timing it around times when maybe you're cheating a little bit more as well.
Sure. And also, can be used to kind of, if you feel like you don't have enough time with your main training sessions during the week to kind of meet that minimum recommended levels of physical activity, I think the exercise snacks, again, can be additive. So they can be used to kind of bring your total exercise volume during the week up to meet those activity levels, or sneak in maybe extra exercise if you don't find you have the time, or you miss a training session, or maybe there's a day where you just don't have the time to dedicate to an actual training session. I'm going to do exercise snacks today, and that could be a suitable alternative.
Very good point. Yeah, and also that psychologically feels good, right? Like I'm checking that box, right?
They do. Yeah, I do exercise snacks during the day, even though I'm training a lot. Just again, mostly like for the psychological benefits. I'll do like some kettlebell swings, some push-ups, some pull-ups. They might help me build a little bit of strength, but definitely get that cognitive boost.
All right, so I think that wraps up our section on aerobic exercise training. We really covered a lot of ground here. This is all covered in our How to Train According to the Experts guide, along with a variety of protocols, more detailed information. Again, you can find that at howtotrainguide.com. We're going to move on to resistance training. This is another area very important for longevity, and also an area that I've actually focused a lot more on in the last year. It really happened after I started having experts in this field of muscle protein synthesis, muscular health, professors like Dr. Stuart Phillips, Dr. Brad Schoenfeld, even experts like Dr. Ling Norton as well, having them on the podcast and just hearing about all the important aspects of maintaining strength, maintaining mass with age, really was eye-opening for me. And so I dedicated a lot more effort and time into resistance training over the last year. Really, some of the statistics that Dr. Stewart had called out on the podcast were kind of scary. First of all, he mentioned that your peak muscle mass occurs between the age of 20 and 30. For me, it was quite a while ago. I mean, you're reaching that point, but that's your peak. And then after that peak, you start to decline on average about 8% per decade. So this age-related decline in muscle mass is often referred to as sarcopenia, and there's a lot of elements that can contribute to that, which I will not get into. But so 8% per decade, and then as you reach the age of 70, that goes up to 15% per decade. And then strength actually declines even quicker than muscle mass. So strength declines annually for men about 3 to 4% per year. And then for women, it's about 2.5 to 3%. Your strength decreases per year on average. Now, if you're engaging in resistance training, strength training, then you're skewing that, right, in a positive way. You're not going to be declining as much. And that's kind of the goal, one of the goals of resistance training. But it's also very important for maintaining functional independence. So your muscle mass, your muscle strength, these are very important for, as you're aging, to have functional independence, to make sure you're lowering your risk of a fracture, a fall. So that's also very important, as well as when you're doing the resistance training, a lot of the exercises that are engaging, multiple muscle groups are also improving bone density as well, right? And that's another aspect that's very beneficial with respect to resistance training. But there's also another part of this equation that's muscle power.
Muscle power, yeah. We recently covered this in one of our newsletters, but researchers have kind of proposed this new term called powerpenia as like a nod to sarcopenia. So powerpenia being the age-related loss of muscle power. And so muscle power, as opposed to muscle strength or muscle mass, is, your ability to generate force quickly. So standing up out of a chair, or, lifting something heavy with a high velocity. Those are all kind of examples of muscle power. And why that's important is because, like strength, obviously, but it's important for predicting your functional independence and essential for activities of daily living, essentially, especially as you get older. And so one of the ways to measure it is using just like a simple sit to stand test on a chair, but like how quickly can you do that? So how quickly can you sit down and rise from a chair? We even, in the study that we covered, that's how they assessed muscle power and showed that it was correlated with actually longevity, which was pretty interesting. So what's unique about muscle power is that it seems to start declining earlier, and then it declines more rapidly than muscle mass or muscle strength. So obviously, how much muscle you have and your strength, all of these things are kind of interrelated, but muscle power seems to be a more sensitive indicator and maybe a more robust indicator of functional outcomes with age. And so muscle power is just as important. You can obviously train for it, as we'll talk about how to train for hypertrophy and strength. Similar, with resistance training, you need to resistance train to improve muscle power. But yeah, this is another idea that hasn't been as necessarily well cited as the declines in muscle mass and strength, but it might actually decline to a greater degree than either.
Yeah, it's not something that's talked about as much either, right? So yeah, we're going to cover a lot of aspects of resistance training, including training for strength and hypertrophy, body composition as well. But I want to start with when I had Dr. Layne Norton on the podcast. He had some really good general principles that people can follow for resistance training. Most people can follow these general principles, and I thought it was really good information that was just, I think, accessible and applicable for a lot of people.
I did too, and it's because they were, very non-technical kind of just advice on how to think about training in general. We're applying this to resistance training, but can it be applied to, any types of training? So he mentioned the first one was consistency. The most effective training regimen is the one that you're going to follow. If you have a coach who prescribes a training regimen to you that is too hard, or that leads to injury, or that you don't enjoy, you're not going to be consistent in executing it, and you need consistency in order to see long-term progress. So his first one was consistency. That's obviously important. Progressive overload is the second one. This is kind of a fundamental aspect of all exercise training. And what progressive overload just means is increasing your dose, your load, your volume, your intensity, however you want to define it, of exercise over time. So with resistance training, week after week, month after month, year after year, you want to continually stress your muscle by lifting a heavier weight in order to cause that muscle to grow, either stronger or bigger or both, however you want to do that. So progressive overload, a key aspect of thinking about resistance training. The third one is going to be recovery. Sometimes a cliche, but you actually get stronger when you aren't exercising, not when you are. So you need to do the training, but you also need to allow your body to recover. And so Layne stressed the importance of recovery. That includes, both just decreasing your training or doing light intensity training or no training at all, doing some light active recovery versus just laying on the couch all day. That's not necessarily the ideal way to recover. And then, focusing on sleep, focusing on eating, focusing on your protein intake, but obviously just eating enough to sustain your training and to rebuild the muscle so it can get stronger. And then the final one was mindset and execution. Focus on execution rather than being perfect. I mean, we in this world of health and fitness, dare I say biohacking, but we like to focus on the very specifics of things, like I got to get the sets perfectly right or the weight perfectly right. And obviously those can be important, but what the main thing is executing it week after week, doing the training and not focusing on you are at the perfect heart rate or the perfect lactate level or lifting, this perfect amount of weight down to the 0.1 kilogram. Just execute week after week, and that will lead to consistent gains. So yeah, again, I think all of the principles that Layne provided when, you were talking to him during your interview were great. And everybody should just keep those, in the back of their minds when they're thinking about training, in addition to, structuring their training, which we will talk about how to do very soon.
Yeah, it's for me, like I mentioned, I've really engaged on this journey in the last year of really being committed to my resistance training. And all of these principles that Layne discussed, I am following. So the consistency for me really involved having a coach and a group of friends that I work out with as well. We do resistance training together. And both of those for me help tremendously with consistency. Now, other people might be different. Some people, I mean, I think generally speaking, accountability does help with consistency. So having a coach or a class you go to or some friends that you work out with routinely, like you have this day per week, you guys are doing this workout together, really helps with consistency. The progressive overload. So working with a coach, this is obvious, probably why I'm able to, but I learned, right, how important it was, where it's like, I don't just right out the bat go and like I'm doing a back squat with 80 pounds. I'm working my way up there. And in many cases, you can consider that like a warm up. But, I start with just bodyweight squats and then I just do the bar and then we progressively load the weight, right? And so that's also a really important aspect as well as recovery. And we're going to talk a little about recovery even between sets and also recovery days. What's interesting is now I've been doing so much of the strength training, resistance training, that my recovery days are my zone 2 runs, which I never would have thought of as recovery days back when I was only just doing running or running in my Peloton. But it's kind of funny how sometimes you call that a recovery, but it really, you're engaging in exercise. You're just it's not so hard on your muscles, right? I also find that doing runs seems to help with the soreness big time.
It definitely does, increasing that blood flow. So I think it's, you basically are doing a form of like active recovery. And that's why I think if you do strength training and or a hard run, even and lay around on the couch all day, the next day you just feel sore, you feel stiff, you don't feel good. So yeah, I think your zone 2 training sessions are kind of having a dual benefit there. They're increasing your fitness, but then they're also providing some good recovery from your resistance training session.
Right. And then mindset, another one. That's a big one. And for me, sometimes I just do it, like especially when I'm doing strength training. If I know how heavy I got, like what was my 1 rep max, so the maximum amount of weight that I could lift for just 1 rep. What did I get to last time, or what was my reps in reserve? Like what was I at for that? I don't think about those things. I'm just doing it, and it really helps to not be a perfectionist, because that can really get in your mind and kind of stress you out.
Yeah,
I think the stress, and that's another thing. When I am under a lot of stress, I kind of just do something a little bit lighter, not quite as intense.
I think it can be counterproductive to train if you're overly psychologically stressed. I mean, when you were talking with Lane, I think he talked about, there are several studies showing like psychological stress, it increases your injury risk. Your training session is not going to be compromised. I mean, I know exercise, for myself and many other people, can be stress relieving, but if there's something majorly stressful and it's going to either compromise your training or increase your injury risk, then you should probably just maybe take a recovery day or take an easy day if you had something more intense planned. So yeah, mindset is definitely important in structuring your training.
I think it becomes more important when you're lifting heavy, like for strength training. So let's talk about strength training. We're talking about training for strength and even bone density, bone mass as well, because there's a lot of overlap there. And Dr. Brad Schoenfeld came on the podcast and really was so knowledgeable in this area and talked quite a bit about strength training and how to, like, the best types of exercises for strength training. And I think one of the take homes here was the multi-joint exercises. These are the compound type of exercises. They're engaging multiple muscle groups and joints simultaneously. They really are the best type of exercise for improving strength. And ultimately, they're more time efficient as well. So these are exercises like squats or deadlifts or lunges, rows of any type of variation, presses, overhead presses, all the variety of types of presses that you can do. These are the multi-joint compound types of exercises. They're essentially improving function. It's functional training. It's also, again, going to improve bone density more because you're putting more force and you're putting more of the force and stressing your bones more with those types of exercises, and that causes the adaptation of bone remodeling. So you're going to have improvements in bone mineral density and bone mass as well. So a lot of the overlap between those multi-joint exercises. When it comes to strength itself, so I guess I should contrast that to the single joint exercises, which are more like bicep curls, tricep kickbacks. What are some other ones? Do you know?
Some single joint exercises. I think, yeah, bicep curls, tricep extensions, leg extensions. Yeah,
that's
all those things. Anything where you're just,
doing a single
joint kind of explains itself.
Well, when you're so strength training in general, is mostly where you're lifting heavier and doing a lower volume, right? So I think Dr. Schoenfeld mentioned, you want to, when you're doing strength training, you're going to get up to about an 85% or more of your 1 rep max, which again is the maximal amount of weight you can lift for 1 rep. And that's strength training. And so oftentimes you're going to do fewer reps than you would if you were not strength training. And you're gonna require a longer recovery. So Dr. Schoenfeld mentioned between 2 to 5 minutes, depending on the weight that you're lifting, depending on how you feel. So I know for me personally, with my strength training, yesterday I was doing strength training with I did back squats, and I got up to 85% of my 1 rep max. So that's where I ended at that weight. Sometimes I go to an actual where I just do 1 rep, but I was doing 85% of my 1 rep max, and I did 5 reps. And I would rest about 3 minutes between that. Typically, I rest between 2 to 3 minutes between my sets. And every person's sort of different. And if you're lifting heavier, you're going to require more rest. And it's really important. And I've learned this where my cardiorespiratory system feels ready to go pretty quickly after I finish my set. And I have to wait and go, wait a minute. If I start to engage again, I'm not going to get the 5 in because my muscles haven't had enough time to recover.
Yeah, Dr. Schoenfeld, I think that was one of the main things he stressed with strength training was there might be that temptation to, rest maybe 1 to 2 minutes or really cut the rest interval just to get to the next set, because it does make the exercise quote unquote harder because you're reducing your rest period. And like you said, if you're in a decent, you have a decent level of aerobic fitness, I think that your heart rate will come down quickly after performing that exercise. So maybe even, psychologically, cardiovascularly, you might feel like, oh, I'm ready to do the next set, but your body literally needs time to replenish the phosphocreatine stores in order to produce, the ATP to do that next set. Your nervous system needs time to rest. And so that's why, Dr. Schoenfeld recommended rest up to anywhere from 2 to 5 minutes, again, based on how much weight you're lifting. If you're doing failure on each set, you might need to do longer. If you're doing 1 to 3 reps in reserves, you might need to take a little bit shorter rest, but 2 to 3 minutes is probably the minimum, anywhere up to 5. And he really emphasized just don't rush the rest period, especially when training for strength, because your goal on each of those sets is to lift the maximum amount of weight that you can. You don't want to, it's not just about fatiguing the muscle. It's, you have to be ready to, if you lift 95% of your 1 rep max on, this set, you want to be able to do that the next set. And you need adequate recovery to be able to do that, particularly if your goal is to improve strength or even muscle power as well could be similar.
Right. You mentioned the central nervous system and that resting being important for your central nervous system to recover. And I'll say that for me, it's been one of the most surprising aspects of strength training in particular is how stressful it is on my central nervous system. Lifting heavy is scary to me. And I don't know, I'm sure as I become stronger, it won't be as scary because I'm more experienced. Now, I've been doing strength training now for, I would say it's been 11 months. So I started last February. So almost a year. And of course, I've been progressively getting to where I am now. But it's hard mentally on me. And I find that it's physically hard too, for sure. But I find that, just that moment before I'm about to lift, like do a clean or, squat down or deadlift, whatever it is, I'm anxious, and it's very stressful for me. In fact, one of the very surprising benefits to strength training for me was the effect on my ability to handle stress throughout the day. Because I do exercise, it's pretty much what I do before I eat and, take care of my family and stuff. But then I exercise. I'm doing my strength training before I work. And I have found that doing the hardest thing for me mentally in the day, first thing in the morning, makes everything else a lot easier. And that was very surprising for me because, I do a lot of stuff that's hard. And but getting that barbell and doing that clean or, lifting that really heavy weight, it's very hard. So it's important, again, to let your central nervous system rest as well. And that is also going back to what we were talking about with Lane, if you're under a very stressed state, it's probably not the time to try to do your personal PR on lifting weights. So
he even mentioned that. He says, if has something planned for the day where he's trying to go like really maximal, like either lift to failure or set like a PR in the squat or deadlift or something, and he's like stressed, then he won't do it because you have to be, not only is it going to raise your injury risk, but you're probably not going to be able to perform that activity because your nervous system just isn't in the state that's primed to do that. I know Lane has like posted videos, and he'll post videos on social media where he's preparing for a lift, and you see how psychologically amped up that he gets before doing that. And like, that's what you got to do, because part of it, you need to be strong to lift a weight, but it's like your nervous system is contributing a lot to lifting the weight during training and trying to set like a PR attempt. So it's one of the aspects I think of training that kind of goes, it's less talked about, but it's certainly important.
I think I need to get some more loud amping music on when I'm strength training, because I don't have any on while I'm doing my strength training. And I'm wondering if that'll help me a little bit with being a little more mentally prepared for it.
It might, or maybe some of those the smelling salts that the lifters use.
Oh. So talking about failure, that's another area that both Dr. Schoenfeld and Dr. Layne Norton have discussed on the podcast in terms of, do you have to go to failure to improve your muscle strength or even mass? Is, for a lot of, I would say a long time, a lot of people thought that going to failure was really the ultimate necessary thing to really get those gains in strength. And in fact, it seems as though, at least according to a lot of the published research that have come out, Dr. Schoenfeld talked about that it's actually not necessary, and also may even could potentially be problematic in some cases, particularly if you're doing like a multi-joint type of exercise, because you can increase your injury risk. And also, as you mentioned, like if you're going to failure, then you kind of like, if you're going to do it, you can't really do another next set without, like, you're going to affect your performance, right? So what were some other things that Dr. Norton and Dr. Schoenfeld mentioned with respect to failure?
It appears, training to failure doesn't appear to be necessary to optimize strength or hypertrophy. It appears at least, pretty equal to training with, a couple reps in reserve. And we'll talk about what that means in a second. But so, training to failure doesn't appear to be necessary. I think if you're going to train to failure, Dr. Schoenfeld seemed to recommend doing machine-based exercises versus on free weights, because the injury risk and the risk of an accident happening is lower. If you're on a machine, you can't drop a weight on yourself really if you're using a machine. So going to failure on machine-based exercises seems to be fine, and on maybe those single joint exercises too. So if you're doing something like a bicep curl, okay, you can do to failure on that, but maybe not going to failure on a barbell back squat or something like that. Those were kind of his recommendations there. So, but in regards to then, if you're not training to failure, what should you do to kind of optimize strength? Both Lane and Dr. Schoenfeld use this concept of reps in reserve. And so essentially what a reps in reserve means is you're lifting to the point of how many repetitions are you away from complete failure. So if you are 3 reps in reserve, that means I do another repetition of exercise, and if I did 3 more of these, I would fail, but I'm going to stop. I'm going to stop with 3 repetitions in reserve. And training with 1 to 3 reps in reserve appears to be just as good as training to failure if your goal is to maximize strength or muscle hypertrophy. So people can kind of use that to guide your training. If you're doing 1 to 3 reps in reserve, that is a good kind of range to stop in terms of if you don't want to train to failure. One of the cool, great recommendations I think from Layne Norton was that everybody train to failure at least once, maybe every training block train to failure at least once, because unless you train to failure, similar to like what we talked about with VO2 max, if you never go to failure, you don't really know what failure feels like. So train to failure once, and then you can prescribe your training based on the reps in reserve because you sort of know what it feels like when your body really doesn't have another repetition left in it. So he recommended training failure at least once, but then, you don't need to train to failure every time you train because one, yes, it compromises your recovery for your next session, increases your injury risk, all of those things. And obviously people are free to train to failure, but it doesn't appear to be optimal or necessary to improve your strength or hypertrophy.
What about so when you're engaging in a lot of compound lifts, in particular, deadlifts, squats, your heart rate gets very elevated. I mean, you're pushing like high intensity training workouts for sure. And there are some people that only strength train, only do resistance training, and they think because their heart rate's getting really elevated, they're filling that cardiovascular aerobic exercise bin because their heart rate's getting elevated. But Dr. Levine came on the podcast and said that really wasn't the case.
Definitely not the case. So strength training cannot be your form of cardio, I think is the too long, didn't read version of that. So yes, while it is true that your heart rate will increase when you do strength training, if you continue to do strength training and compare it to aerobic exercise training, for one, you don't get the same improvement. So if you do, if you look at all the benefits of aerobic exercise training that include like improvements in endothelial function, cardiovascular structure, like we talked about, blood pressure, you don't get those same benefits from resistance exercise training. So that is kind of one reason why you should do both, why endurance runners should strength train, why strength training people should do a lot of endurance exercise training. And even Levine said, he consults with NFL players, football players, and he recommends that everybody do some aerobic exercise training. And the reason for that, though, is interesting and is kind of rooted in, the mechanisms of why heart rate increases during endurance exercise versus aerobic exercise. So during aerobic exercise, your heart rate increases because there is an elevated metabolic demand in the muscle, and therefore your cardiac output needs to increase to deliver more blood flow to the muscles, and that means your heart rate and your stroke volume both increase. During strength training, though, the drive for the increase in heart rate is mainly from the autonomic nervous system. So it's driven by central command. So if you think about, if you just are here, and Dr. Levine used the example where you're just clenching your fist as hard as possible or like grasping something maybe, well, your heart rate is going to increase, but that's just due to a drive from your central nervous system. So versus a metabolic demand increasing in the muscle, or like the drive for increased blood flow during aerobic exercise. So your heart rate increases for different reasons during strength training compared to aerobic exercise, and you don't get the cardiac adaptations from strength training that you do from aerobic exercise. So they're not the same, they're not comparable. Yes, heart rate increases during strength training, but it is not a form of quote unquote cardio or endurance aerobic exercise.
It was fascinating to me to hear Dr. Levine's explanation of that, and for that, basically why your heart rate elevates so much when you're doing a strength training. And especially given my anecdote, right, where I was just talking about how surprised I was how much my central nervous system was involved in strength training. I wonder if there is some connection there as well. I just had, I had no idea that it was like it's mentally taxing on my brain. Strength training it's very much uses a lot of my central nervous system is very active, I guess is the way to put it. But let's shift gears and talk a little bit about hypertrophy training, right? So there's a lot of overlap with strength training here. And Dr. Schoenfeld on the podcast was talking about, hypertrophy training. So this is the type of training that people are interested in with the goal of increasing their muscle size, their muscle mass, right? Hypertrophy, muscle hypertrophy. And essentially, the biggest difference that he was mentioning is the weight, right? So you're not lifting as heavy, and you're increasing the volume, right? So you're lifting lighter and you're increasing the volume. So typically, I mentioned with strength training, people are getting up to about 85% of their 1 rep max. With hypertrophy training, it's more like 60 to 80% of your 1 rep max. And so you're doing more reps rather than doing up to 5 reps for what you'd be doing with strength training. You're doing like 6 to 10 or 12 reps. And so this is I would say like one of the biggest general principles that Dr. Schoenfeld talked about on the podcast with respect to training for muscle hypertrophy. Resting is also a little bit lower. Like you don't have, it's shorter. You don't have to rest quite as long because you're not lifting as heavy. So you're resting for 1 to maybe 2 minutes between your sets versus 2 to 5 minutes. So that's also seems like a big difference. And then when it comes to like exercise selection, Dr. Schoenfeld mentioned, I mean, it really depends on what you're interested in, right? So it seems best to do these multi-joint exercises, right? So you're doing deadlifts, you're doing squats, you're doing presses, rows, because not only are you getting gains in muscle hypertrophy, strength, you're also getting functional, you're improving your function, your muscular function and power. A lot of power is in things like squats or lunges or things that are causing you to use muscular power, although you can get some of that with bicep curls as well. But some guys are interested in their bigger biceps. And so focusing on bicep curls obviously would be something that they'd be interested in. For myself, I do a lot of compound exercises with, some bicep curls and tricep kickbacks and stuff as well. But the majority of my training is definitely compound exercises.
Yeah, I think with regard to order and exercise selection, I mean, you would think somebody like Dr. Brad Schoenfeld would be very hyper-focused on you need to pick the perfect order and the perfect exercise to optimize hypertrophy, and, him being an experienced lifter and bodybuilder, physique competitor himself, but he really seemed unconcerned with it. And, when he was really talking about it, I think this goes back to focusing on execution rather than perfection. He just says, the muscles that you want to get bigger, train those first, and then train the muscles that you aren't as concerned about growing afterwards. And same thing with exercise selection. There are lots of exercises that could target the muscles that you might want to grow bigger. So whether you choose a squat or a deadlift or a leg extension, it might not matter. Just make sure to, if you want your legs to grow, then do leg exercises and make sure you're getting the quality sets and reps and time under tension for those muscle groups. And really don't just get focused on the kind of nuances maybe. Obviously, there are people who are interested in that. But when thinking about what exercises to do, what order to do them in, it seemed pretty straightforward. Just focus on what you want to get larger. Do those exercises first, and then kind of everything then comes after.
Yeah, it's pretty straightforward. I like that. It's not a very complicated concept to understand.
There are lots of different types of exercises, and people can choose the ones that they enjoy the most and that are going to obviously, help them grow, but also reduce their injury risk using machines versus free weights. He didn't seem to be concerned with that either, and even cited some meta-analyses showing, is hypertrophy better with machines or free weights? Seem to be equal. So I think that goes to show that there are multiple paths to hypertrophy, and you can choose whether you prefer to do free weights or machines. Doesn't seem to matter much.
I think the one question I wish I'd asked him back then, when I wasn't engaged in so much of resistance training, was yes, hypertrophy, but functional independence, right? Like reducing fall risk, being able to get in and out of a chair. I wonder how much of that you're going to get with machines versus doing Olympic lifting or like a squat, deadlifts, things like that with a barbell. And I don't know. I think I maybe talked a little bit about this with Lane, and he said you might get a little bit more bang for your buck with using like a barbell or doing a squat with a barbell versus like a hack squat. But at the end of the day, if you are increasing your muscle strength and your muscle mass, you're definitely going to be reducing your fall risk as well. So
yeah, exactly. I think it makes a little bit of sense if you really are focused on the quote unquote functional training to do, maybe more stuff with free weights that mimic natural movements. But like you said, if you're getting stronger, even if it's on a machine, then you're getting stronger, and that's going to help you within functional independence and activities.
Yeah, you need to do what you like, which
Exactly.
you're going to be consistent with. I mean, that's like paramount, right? Like the most important thing. Training for body composition. So Dr. Schoenfeld, Dr. Lang Norton, both of them talked quite a bit about training for body composition on a podcast. And so a lot of people are interested in losing fat and simultaneously gaining muscle. So body recomposition. And Dr. Schoenfeld talked about, and this is a common thing with weight loss in general. So when people are on a weight loss diet, which most of the time involves caloric restriction to some degree, they end up losing some muscle mass, right? It's not just fat that's being lost. And he cited a study that even up to 30% of the weight that's lost can come from muscle or lean body mass. So I think that's important to consider because if you're not engaging in some form of resistance training, then you are at a higher risk for losing muscle, even though you may be losing fat. And so I think there's a variety of take-homes here that were talked about on the podcast in terms of like the best what sort of template to follow with respect to body recomposition. So obviously engaging in resistance training, number one, right?
Yeah. Engaging in resistance training. Yeah. If you're losing weight and you don't resist training, you're going to lose lean body mass. So engaging in resistance training, ideally 3 times per week. If your goal is body recomposition, which means, you either want to maintain your lean mass or increase it, probably, you need to engage in resistance training 3 times per week, probably, and lift pretty heavy, probably with a focus on more hypertrophy-based training versus strength-based training. So that was obviously their one recommendation, and it was above all else, it's like resistance training. So second of all, though, is if you do want to lose a little bit of fat, you'll probably will have to eat in a caloric deficit. And you don't want it to be too drastic, though, because I think similar to not engaging in resistance training, if you drastically cut calories too much while you're trying to attain body recomposition, you risk losing more lean mass. So you want kind of a more conservative weight loss approach, maybe 1 to 2 pounds a week. And to do that, Dr. Schoenfeld recommended eating 10 to 20% below your maintenance calories. That was kind of his recommendation there. Maybe you're increasing your exercise more, so your deficit might be a little bit less, but it might not cause you to you need to eat less because you're exercising more. So the 10 to 20% kind of reduction in calories. And then protein intake was a super large focus of all of their recommendations. They emphasized eating, anywhere from 2.2 grams per kilogram of body weight per day, which would be 1 gram per pound, or even more, if your goal is to gain muscle. And that is key because eating protein, a higher protein diet, tends to have a few benefits. So not only the lean mass maintenance benefits that come with protein, but it also has a thermogenic effect. So protein, when you eat a higher protein diet, it kind of causes your body to increase its caloric burn for digestive purposes, which may lead to a slightly greater caloric deficit. And then satiety as well. Lane talked a lot of bit about this. Eating a higher protein diet may help with satiety to help you kind of eat less throughout the day. Again, some people don't have the goal of weight loss, so that might not be a concern. But if you're aiming for body recomposition and are aiming for that slight caloric deficit, all of those things tend to help improve that. So those were kind of some of their core recommendations for body recomposition. And I think the key takeaway was that it is possible to lose fat and gain muscle at the same time. It's going to depend on your baseline body composition. If you're already 10% body fat and, it might be a little bit harder to do body recomp, but if you have some weight to lose, are newer to resistance training, those can certainly be accomplished. It doesn't require doing one, losing a lot of weight and then building up a lot of muscle. You could do both at the same time.
I think the other thing that Lane had mentioned is that, most people don't even really know how many calories they're eating in a day, which is so true.
Mm-hmm.
So you kind of have to be able to track that at least for a couple of days and get an average to know how much to cut out, right? And then again, if you want to if you're going to increase the amount of protein, making sure it's not really fatty protein either, right? Like this is where something like a protein powder comes in. It's very handy because you can increase that protein without a lot of calories, right, as well.
Right. Sleep too was one of the things Lane also mentioned. He cited a study showing that if you don't get enough sleep, it actually will hamper your gains in lean mass loss, and it can make a kind of body fat loss a little bit more stubborn, so harder. So if you're not sleeping enough while you're training, you're not going to gain as much lean mass as you could, and you're not going to lose as much fat as you could. So focusing on that recovery aspect, that aspect of sleep, stress management, all of those things would be important as well. And not just for body recomposition, but, that was one of the key principles.
Yeah, sleep is important for brain health, your immune system, just cardiovascular health, everything.
Hopefully people are aware of that by now, if they're not.
I think another aspect that a lot of people are interested in, and certainly myself, is time-efficient protocols for resistance training. And this is certainly we were talking about time-efficient protocols for aerobic exercise and high-intensity interval training being at the top of the list there. Dr. Schoenfeld has actually published a couple of studies on time efficiency and how to be efficient with your resistance training workout. He talked about it on the podcast. I really liked a few of the principles that he had covered. Going back again to multi-joint exercises, they are the most time efficient. You are going to be training multiple muscle groups at once. So squats, deadlifts, lunges, rows, presses, those are really great types of exercises to do if you are pressed for time. And then he also talked about using supersets and drop sets. And so this is something I also use in my workouts. Supersets are typically when you are engaging back-to-back different exercises that are working different muscle groups without any rest. And so you're doing back-to-back ones. So for example, you're doing bicep curls, and then you after your bicep curls, you go straight into tricep kickbacks. Then you go into lateral raises or frontal raises, and you go back, and then you do, hammer curls, and then you go back to some sort of tricep kick, and you're doing them like back to back, right? Like, so those are the supersets, and you really get fatigued. And it is a very time efficient way. Like, you can get a really good workout in 10 minutes, doing 10 minutes nonstop, just switching from, muscle group to muscle group, doing these sort of supersets as well. And then drop sets is another type of training that involves basically, I do a lot of drop sets on the tail end of my strength training. So it involves like reducing the load and then performing another set. You increase the volume, you reduce the load and increase the volume, and then you perform another set back to back. So let's say you did a squat workout, strength training squat workout. You then drop the weight way down. You're at like 60% of your 1 rep max, and then you do 10 of those, rest for a minute, and then 10 again. So that would be an example of drop sets. And that's also a very, and there's a lot of different ways you can do drop sets. I just talked about the way I do it. Dr. Schoenfeld talked about a variety of other ways to do it. We also cover that in the guide as well. But I do think that's another really time efficient way to engage in resistance training. And then you can combine, a lot of different types of training, right? So you can do your strength training and then do some hypertrophy training within that same exercise session. You can avoid a lot of warming up. In fact, the warm up, rather than like stretching for like doing all these like stretches where you're like, I don't know, is this really that important? Maybe you can stretch for like 3 minutes, 4 minutes or whatever, or less. And then your warming up is actually just like progressively loading, right? So you're like I said, you do body weight squats, or you do your squat with the barbell, and then you get to your weight, right? Like the much more productive way to warm up, because you're actually warming up your muscles.
Yeah, just do the exercise that you're going to perform, but either unweighted or, with a very light weight. If you're going to do a bench press, your warm-up could just be just doing the bar for 15, 20 reps or whatever. And yeah, in fact, static stretching as compared to dynamic stretching actually appears to have no performance benefit. If anything, it's detrimental. So standing there and doing, your little arm exercises, that's actually hurting your performance. So just like unweight the bar and do some reps. If you're mimicking the exercise you're going to do, it's a dynamic warm-up. That appears to be much better for sure.
Was there any other time efficient protocols that were important?
Yeah, I think Dr. Schoenfeld did cite a study on these sort of micro resistance training workouts where people performed 15 minutes of resistance training 6 to 8 times per week versus, say, doing the same resistance training, same volume, same exercises 3 to 4 times a week for, say, 30 to 40 minutes. They achieved the same level of strength and hypertrophy. I can't remember what was exactly measured in that study, but so you can kind of do these micro workouts. So maybe you have a small window to exercise every single day of the week, not much time, but you could just do 15 minutes of resistance exercise. Okay, well, delegate out your different kind of exercises. Maybe do just bench press one day and leg extension one day, and every day do something. It seems maybe that's not the most efficient, but some people, if that fits into your schedule, it seems to produce kind of a similar level of strength and gains to 3 or 4 like longer duration sessions. So that could be another time efficient way. And you could also do cardio and strength training or high intensity interval training on the same day. So, again, you might be even more warmed up if you do a 60-minute zone 2 session and then go to the gym and get your strength training in, or do your Norwegian 4x4 and do some strength training afterwards. I think depending on your goal might determine the order of those. So if you really are focused on aerobic training and then strength training is second, so someone like me, I'm going to do my long run and then I'm going to do strength training versus the other way around, because that strength training is going to get in the way of the quality of my run if I do it beforehand. Whereas somebody who's strength focused might want to do strength training and then end with cardio because their goal is strength, not the endurance exercise session. So I think that should probably determine your order, but doing those on the same day could be time efficient. As for the whole like interference effect, people sometimes get worried about, like, oh, is doing aerobic exercise on the strength training day going to compromise my gains due to the molecular interference of the different signals that govern like endurance, adaptations, and strength? That whole thing has been kind of dismissed. There's not any really such thing. It only occurs if you're obviously compromising the quality of your sessions by doing them both on the same day. But yeah, and combining cardio and strength, this can definitely be compatible in a way that to be time efficient with your exercise.
I think if anything, Dr. Schoenfeld talked about there might even be a benefit to combining because the increased blood flow to muscle, you're getting more nutrients there, you're getting more oxygen. So it actually improves recovery time. It decreases the amount of time you need to recover. So you might even get some benefits there as well. So the microsets is funny that I forgot that one because my husband he does a lot of that type of resistance training work. He does a lot of microsets throughout the week, and it really does depend on someone's schedule and what suits them best as well. But it's nice to have all these options, and I think it's kind of is a good segue into like the minimum amount of time required in quotes to basically get some strength and hypertrophy benefits. And I think Dr. Schoenfeld talked a little bit about this as well.
Yeah, 2 times per week, 30 minutes at a time seems to be compatible with maintaining or even building strength. He cited multiple studies, and even recently they have published a couple showing that just engaging in resistance training 2 times per week, 30 minutes, that seems to be probably the bare minimum if you want to maintain or increase your muscle strength. And then obviously you can work up from there based on kind of what your goals are. But I think 3 times per week is probably optimal. And then, really if you're someone wanting to build a lot of strength or you're a performance-oriented athlete, doing 4 to 5 days per week. But yeah, I think it's great to hear, especially for someone like me who doesn't do a ton of strength training and needs to do more, that you can really do a lot in 2 sessions per week. But obviously that means during those 2 sessions, if you're just going to do them, you don't be on your phone a ton of the time. You probably want to do supersets. You probably want to do some drop sets to kind of make the most of that. But two times per week, 30 minutes at a time seems to be enough. So if people are really concerned with that time efficiency, you can accomplish a lot in that.
I think he also mentioned the micro dosing as well. So it doesn't necessarily have to be 2 30-minute sessions. You can do that. The more sessions of like 10 or 15 minute sessions that you're doing multiple times, as long as the total time is the same.
Yes, exactly.
So again, all of this is in our How to Train guide. You can find all these protocols and information. Download that copy, howtotrainguide.com. We're going to move on to the last section that is covered in our guide, and this really is sort of supplemental to the exercise protocols. We're going to cover a lot of supplemental protocols like deliberate heat exposure, for example, using a sauna, some nutrition, protein intake, and then also some supplements like omega-3 fatty acids and creatine. So starting with deliberate heat exposure, drawing from some of the leading experts in this area of sauna research, Dr. Jari Laukkanen being one of the world's experts on how the sauna is affecting cardiovascular health. I've had him on the podcast many years ago, and he has published just numerous studies on how the sauna affects cardiorespiratory fitness, how it's affecting blood pressure, cardiac compliance, arterial compliance, just a lot of different cardiovascular health parameters. And his research has shown in a couple different ways. So there's been observational data showing people that exercise and use the sauna have a lower all-cause mortality than people that exercise and don't use the sauna. But he's also done some interventional studies where he's taken 2 groups of people and put them on an exercise protocol, aerobic exercise on a stationary bike, and then only half of that group then went into a sauna after the exercise, and he measured cardiorespiratory fitness and found that people that use the sauna in addition to aerobic exercise improve their cardiorespiratory fitness even more than people that only did the exercise. And there were other cardiometabolic parameters that were also improved. Cholesterol was improved, blood pressure was improved more as well. So it seems as though adding the sauna in addition to an exercise routine is another way to improve some cardiometabolic endpoints and also cardiorespiratory fitness. There's also some endurance benefits as well, something that I've talked about before on the podcast. In fact, you, Brady, use the sauna in your exercise protocol.
I do. And, a lot of that has to do with some of the research that you've talked about and that Dr. Laukkanen has published. So I informed kind of my strategy based on this. Not only, the studies show that you can improve your VO2 max, additionally by using the sauna, but it also improves your exercise performance, not only in the heat, which kind of makes sense. You're using the sauna, you're becoming more heat acclimated, but it also improves your performance just in normal weather, or like not hot weather, I guess, as you would call it. So I integrate that in my training. Not only just do I like the sauna for the cardiovascular benefits and the brain benefits, after reading these studies, kind of hearing you talk about it, I think, it makes sense to use it. So about 3 times per week, 2 to 3 times per week, I'll try to get into the sauna immediately or within 5 to 10 minutes of finishing one of my runs. So I'll, do my run from the gym. I don't have a sauna at home, but I have one at the gym that I use, and I'll finish my run. I'll get right into the sauna for another 20 to 30 minutes. That seems to be the protocols used in many of the studies. They do typically a 20-minute sauna bath afterwards. So I'll get right in there, try to keep it so that my heart rate is like staying a little bit elevated from the end of the run into the sauna. So I think of it as a way to sort of extend that cardio session a little bit, that endurance training session. Because when you're in the sauna, the heart rate might not be as high as it was when I was running 130, 40, 50 beats per minute, but it'll be 110 maybe at the end of the sauna. So I use that as a strategy. Again, 1, because it feels good and I just like it, but 2, to gain maybe some additional benefits to that endurance exercise training session.
I do the same. I get in the sauna after both aerobic exercise training as well as doing my strength training, resistance training exercise. And a lot of the data that Dr. Laukkanen has published has been observational data looking at people that are routinely using the sauna and the effects of that on cardiovascular related mortality, all-cause mortality. And it seems as though like the minimum effective dose to get some benefits is really 2 times a week of sauna use. If you get up to 4 times a week, then you're really getting maximal benefits of 4 to 7 times a week. People are getting reductions up to 50% in their cardiovascular related mortality, 40% related to reductions in their all-cause mortality. And this sauna doesn't have to be so hot. I mean, this isn't like the 200 and something degree temperatures that you often hear people cite that they're using. In fact, I think that's a little bit too hot. I mean, these people are using on average 175 degrees Fahrenheit. Often there is a little bit of a humidity, 30 up to 30% humidity as well, but they're in there for about 20 minutes. And so I find it is nice to get into the sauna after a workout and extend that sort of aerobic exercise mimicking capacity a little bit further. Another area that using deliberate heat exposure could be beneficial is combining it with resistance training or even using it during perhaps an injury when you're not able to work out. And I would say a lot of this evidence is preliminary and more needs to be done. But going off the preliminary evidence and just knowing that there's benefits for cardiovascular health as well, why wouldn't you? There has been at least some preliminary evidence in one small study that people that got in the sauna after the resistance training protocol increased signaling molecules that are involved, anabolic signaling molecules that are involved in muscle hypertrophy. There's also been another trial in humans that underwent, it was this experiments that are done where they mobilize a muscle for a period of time and they look at atrophy after that, right? Disuse atrophy is what it's called. And it seems as though heat exposure, at least at the local level in this regard for this study, people that had the heat exposure were about almost 40% less likely to lose. They lost 40% less of their muscle mass, which is quite a bit. So a lot of potential reasons there. Heat shock proteins have been shown to be activated. A lot of disuse atrophy studies done in animal models with heat exposure. And then you're getting a variety of endocrine effects as well. Growth hormone is elevated when you get in the sauna, and that can have aspects for recovery as well. So there's a lot of reasons to combine deliberate heat exposure with also resistance training workout. And I would say that is not the case for deliberate cold exposure.
Yeah, and in fact, I think a lot of the evidence would suggest the opposite lately, where getting in cold immediately after resistance exercise in particular seems to blunt some of the hypertrophic benefits. There's a lot of press about those studies now where it's like avoid the cold after your resistance training workout. So yeah, it makes sense to really embrace the heat, not only for recovery, but for the anabolic potential, the endurance exercise benefits. I think, the anabolic potential is interesting because, I don't know if there are any studies out there showing greater hypertrophy after using heat, but like you said, with the heat shock protein, all the mechanisms kind of make sense. And so there was recently like a review paper that just came out that we'll need to probably read and maybe write about on that, because I think heat is becoming kind of embraced. And yeah, again, the cold, maybe not something to do around your resistance exercise sessions.
Right. And Dr. Luc Van Loon, who was a guest on the podcast as well, he has done some research on that, and in fact showed that doing deliberate cold exposure, like a cold bath, immediately after resistance training workout does blunt hypertrophy. I mean, so that's
muscle protein synthesis all goes down if you get in the cold right afterwards. So something to avoid, probably.
Kind of circling back to the disuse atrophy, that's something that's obviously very relevant for people if they're injured, or perhaps they're traveling somewhere and they don't have they're working their muscles out the same way that they usually do. And so there's a case to be made, where it's like, okay, well, I'm not going to be engaging my muscles as much, and you're kind of like, you don't use it, you lose it, right? And this is where a supplement that I'm quite fond of for a variety of reasons. Omega-3 fatty acids seem to be beneficial. So Dr. Chris McGlory came on the podcast and talked about some of his research using high dose omega-3. So it was about 5 grams a day, which is a little bit higher than what is prescribed for some people for different cardiometabolic reasons. Was able to prevent or cut disuse atrophy almost by 50%. In this case, it was in women. So omega-3 fatty acids might be another sort of tool for recovery, right? Use during perhaps illness, injury. I think they should be used every day. There's a lot of benefits, cardiovascular benefits as well, anti-inflammatory benefits. Again, going down to the recovery, and omega-3 fatty acids being beneficial for inflammation. Perhaps for someone like yourself, it might be even more useful, right? Where you're really running what, 20 hours a week almost. There's a lot of stress on your muscles, and a lot of inflammatory cytokines and molecules that are generated during that kind of training. And so.
The heart too, I think, it was maybe something that you had posted, but I think there was a study showing omega-3 fatty acids could prevent some of the cardiac injury biomarkers after endurance running or after downhill running. So yeah, I look at some of those studies, and I mean, I do take omega-3 myself. I think I take 2 grams per day. So maybe I need to up my dose to 3 to 5 grams per day based on some of this research here. But yeah, like cardiac stuff too, I think makes sense to take that for recovery purposes for sure.
Yeah, I think it was 3 grams a day, and it decreased the troponin levels which is a marker of cardiac stress. Okay, so we're also going to kind of transition to some of the nutritional aspects of this guide, starting with protein, which is probably, I guess, the most important when it comes to muscle mass, muscle hypertrophy, anything and all things muscle. Dr. Stuart Phillips was on the podcast. Dr. Brad Schoenfeld talked quite a bit about protein intake. Dr. Luc Van Loon, Dr. Lang Norton, quite a few experts have been on talking about the importance of protein intake, how the RDA for protein, which is 0.8 grams per kilogram body weight, does not appear to be enough for maintaining muscle mass, particularly if you are engaging in resistance training. In fact, Stu Phillips was a author on a study that was a meta-analysis of multiple randomized controlled trials that found that people that on average were taking in about 1.2 grams of protein per kilogram body weight and were engaged in a resistance training protocol, if they up that to about 1.6 grams per kilogram body weight, they had a 27% increase in muscle mass and a 10% increase in muscle strength compared to people that were resistance training, but only doing the 1.2 grams per kilogram body weight, so of protein intake. So I think that's a pretty easy lever we can pull in terms of increasing our muscle mass and strength with not as much effort, right? It takes a lot of effort to lift weights, but to increase your protein intake isn't quite as much effort.
Yeah, but I think something to note there too is that while Stu Phillips and Brad Schoenfeld and basically all of the experts who we put evidence for into this guide, they recommended these protein intakes quoted that it was very important, but all of them really emphasize that nothing kind of compares to the resistance training. So yeah, protein intake is important, but if you're not resistance training, you're kind of really missing out on that aspect. So I think protein intake can be seen as kind of necessary, but not sufficient for muscle growth. You can't just eat more protein and get bigger. You got to do the training, but it is certainly important. And I think total daily protein intake was one of the things that stood out as that is the most important factor when it comes to if people have questions about how much or when do I eat it or how much or how do I distribute it. Total daily protein intake, that seems to be the most important thing. So just making sure you're getting enough during the day. But two things that were also talked about were regarding protein distribution. So, and that refers to, timing and distribution, I guess is how we could phrase it. So when to eat your protein, particularly maybe with regards to exercise, and then how to distribute it throughout the day. Regarding timing, there's this concept known as the anabolic window. And this was kind of an earlier idea where it was once thought that, after you ended your resistance training session, you need to consume protein immediately afterwards. Otherwise, you would sacrifice your gains. So if you didn't eat protein within 30 minutes after finishing resistance training, then you were leaving gains on the table. You weren't going to grow as strong. You weren't going to grow as big. Dr. Brad Schoenfeld, I really liked what he said about that. He refers to it more as an anabolic barn door. So it's just a lot larger than, the 30 minutes that was kind of once thought. You don't need to eat immediately after you train. Now, that's not to say that you can't. I mean, in fact, I think if you have the opportunity to, you should. It makes sense to eat as quickly after your exercise session as possible because your muscles are more sensitive to amino acids at that point. So yes, eat a meal, have some protein immediately after resistance training if you can. If you have to wait 2 to 3 hours, it's probably you're still going to be okay. In fact, there was just a recent study that came out that showed delaying protein intake versus immediately after, they both lead to similar gains in hypertrophy and strength. So, if as long as you're getting enough throughout the day, you don't need to be that concerned with the timing it right around exercise. So that seemed to be one of the key takeaways, and people, may not need to be as stressed about that when they're thinking about their protein timing. And then protein distribution was another thing that Luc Van Loon discussed a lot in terms of what is optimal. So is it optimal, if you want to eat 2 meals per day with 2 very large doses of protein, is that worse or better than consuming 3 to 4 evenly spaced meals throughout the day? Based on, muscle protein synthesis data that Luc Van Loon cited, it seems to be optimal to eat 3 to 4 protein containing meals containing, 25 to 30 grams or more throughout the day, evenly spaced. That's for optimizing muscle protein synthesis. Does it appear to be better for muscle gain? Maybe not, but it in theory kind of would produce greater gains due to the greater muscle protein synthesis response. But he also said that, if you're just a 2 meal per day person or even a 1 meal per day person, if you want to eat 100 grams of protein at once, that can be digested, absorbed, used for muscle protein synthesis. They published a kind of popular study recently showing that, but it certainly doesn't seem to be ideal. So regarding protein distribution, evenly distributed protein during the day appears to be optimal, secondary, obviously, to getting enough protein throughout the day.
Yeah. All this information and more I recently covered in an episode on the science of protein. For those of you that haven't checked it out, make sure you check it out if you're interested in protein and the effects of protein on aging, muscle mass, strength, all things considered. Definitely check that out. I kind of want to move lastly to the last sort of aspect in the training guide, and that has to do with creatine supplementation. And Dr. Stuart Phillips and also Dr. Lane Norton both mentioned creatine as one of their top tier supplements that they take. Lots and lots of evidence on safety and efficacy. I take it, you take it. Maybe you can talk a little bit about, just summarize briefly for people, what are some of the benefits of creatine supplementation, how people should start, dose, some of the best practices.
I think creatine, I feel like it's probably like one of the most popular supplements these days, and everybody is taking it, or if they're not, they probably should be due to the evidence that's coming out. So yeah, creatine, it's something that we get from the diet, but that you can supplement with it to get more. Regarding, how much you should take, I think that currently the recommendations and, based on what Dr. Stu Phillips and Lee Norton and others said, taking 5 to 10 grams per day appears to be the optimal dose. If you're a bit larger, you could maybe, take 10 to 15, but even 5 grams per day after a while will probably saturate your muscle creatine stores, especially if you're consuming a lot of meat, which does contain creatine too. So you're getting some from your diet and supplementing. So in regards to how to dose, there was once a thought that you had to do this loading dose when you started supplementing. So you take 20 grams per day for a week, and then you go down to a maintenance dose of 5 to 10 grams per day indefinitely. The loading dose isn't necessarily recommended anymore. It's pretty much just start taking 5 to 10 grams per day tomorrow and never stop it. So the loading dose doesn't appear to be optimal unless for some reason you need to get your muscle creatine stores up in the next few days, then you need to take a loading dose. But for most people, that doesn't appear to be important. So it's pretty easy supplement to take. It doesn't matter what time of day you take it because it doesn't have the acute benefits. So just find a time during the day when it works and makes sense to take it. Take 5 to 10 grams and just continue to take it. It seems to have benefits for muscle performance and building strength. Obviously, that's kind of where the main benefits are probably most evidenced, and it was thought of as being like this bodybuilding strength supplement, which it obviously is. So it allows you to train harder, which then allows you to build more strength and muscle mass. But I think there's a lot of evidence coming out that it might be good for older adults to take for muscle strength as well. For endurance athletes, it probably makes sense for them to take it. And then there's a lot of stuff coming out about creatine in the brain for, during sleep deprivation. So just a lot of evidence that it's good to take. There appear to be very few side effects. It's very safe. And all of the myths, I think Stu was talking about some of the myths regarding hair loss or kidney health, and Lane even mentioned some of those, and none of those really appear to be valid. Creatine is well studied, and so it's something that most people can benefit from. And it's, again, pretty simple to take. It's just buy creatine monohydrate, take 5 to 10 grams per day, and just continue to take it. After about a month or so, that's kind of when the benefits might start to appear, because that's when your muscle stores are saturated.
I take about 5 grams a day.
Yeah, as do I. I take 5 grams per day. I've been experimenting with taking 10 grams per day on the weekend for no reason. I run longer on those days, so I'm like, maybe for recovery purposes, just take 10 grams. It's just something I'm trying, but yeah, usually I'm 5 grams per day.
I thought about experimenting with 10 grams. It's hard to sometimes notice differences, subtle differences like that, especially when you're taking so many other things and doing so many other things, right? But I've also thought about kind of increasing the dose just to see, like, can I lift a little bit heavier? Is it going to affect my strength as well?
Yeah, it might be worth trying out. I think one more thing about creatine to note is that, like, I think people are concerned. Stu Phillips mentioned he doesn't take it all the time, and that if he goes on vacation, he might just not take it because it's not important. It does appear that after you stop taking it, your stores will still stay saturated for about 1 to 2 weeks. So if you go on vacation and forget your creatine, then just eat more steak maybe on vacation and supplement when you come back.
Yeah, that's good to know.
Yeah.
I've definitely not taken it on vacations before, especially because my container is this big of it.
TSA also might think they might get a little bit skeptical due to how it looks.
I know. I often wonder that sometimes when I'm aliquoting powders and stuff. I'm like, is this going to get my bag flat? Yeah. That is to say, all of this wonderful information, very useful, practical information, protocols, everything can be found in the How to Train According to the Expert's Guide. You can pause now, download that at howtotrainguide.com. Wonderful training guide that Brady was a big part in working on. Thank you so much, Brady, for sitting down, first of all, for working on the guide and for sitting down with me to discuss it. I do want to plug your book you have, VO2 Max Essentials. You also have a Substack page you can tell people about, and you're very active on Twitter, X. I follow you there. You post a lot of really great stuff on exercise, physiology. So maybe you can tell people where to follow you up on those platforms.
Yeah, thanks, Rhonda. So VO2 Max Essentials is just the book that I self-published. You can get it on Amazon. And Substack, I write kind of like a weekly newsletter based on, studies in health, exercise, nutrition, kind of whatever I find interesting that week. It's Physiologically Speaking. I kind of picked somewhat of a difficult name, but people should be able to find that. And then on X, I am just B_Holmer, HOLMER. So people can find me on there. It's where I'm most active, and posting a lot about, topics similar to what we talked about today.
Awesome. All right. Well, thank you so much, Brady.
Yeah, thanks, Rhonda. This was great.
Thanks so much for listening to today's episode. Nearly 80% of you watching right now are not subscribed. In my YouTube videos, I emphasize excellence, and as a result, I don't release episodes all that often. So please subscribe and click the bell to get notified when we release a new episode. I'll see you next time.